Hello everyone. This is What If Luffy Got All His Powers at a Young Age. Please like and subscribe, 8 likes for next part and enjoy. After landing back down on the blue sea, with the help of a friendly octopus, the wound in the ship's keel expanded. Luffy knew this. He heard the creaking, but since his crew was in such good spirits, he simply didn't have the heart to tell them yet. After some emergency repairs by Usopp, they set sail towards the next destination. Luffy knew already what that was. Water 7. He hoped to avoid both of the near disasters the crew suffered there. He was pretty sure that with proper handling of the situation, Usopp wouldn't leave the crew again, but it was another matter with Robin. He didn't know what he should do with her. Would she really do the same thing considering how much stronger he had proven to be this time? Logic told him no, but there was that uneasy feeling. "You can do it, Captain." A familiar childish voice encouraged him. His eyes opened and widened. He sat up on the hammock that he had laid on. "Mary?" he asked in thought. "I'm still here, my captain." The voice chirped out cheerfully. "Do you think Robin will do it again, Mary?" he asked. "You don't know, so I don't know, Captain." The voice told him. He grimaced. "Right," he thought. He looked at the door for a few moments. "You know, it's really awkward if you know all my thoughts," he thought after a while. "Captain," the childish voice scolded. "I'd never betray your thoughts." There was a silence for a while. "Even the dirty ones?" the voice added after a while. Luffy's jaw dropped slightly, while his face gained a tint of red. He huffed and turned his head to the left. The voice laughed cheekily. Luffy stood up after a moment and got a shirt on. "My ship just accused me of being a pervert," he thought to himself. He half expected another comment from the childish-sounding voice, but thankfully he received none. He shook his head. He climbed up the mast and headed towards the kitchen, walking between the large boxes and crates of gold on the deck. "I wonder what Sanji made for breakfast." Luffy thought and a few ideas flashed in his mind, making his mouth water. Then as he approached the door, he overheard some things being said. "But what if he overhears you?" a voice called out, presumably Usopp. "Nami Swan can talk about anything she wants." Sanji swooned. Luffy could just imagine him swirling around with a heart in his eye. "Right. Thank you, Sanji-kun," Nami answered. "My pleasure, Nami-san," the blonde cook answered. "I exist only to serve a goddess such as yourself." "Humph, idiot cook," a gruff-sounding voice commented. "Why you shitty Maremo?" the cook responded. "Enough," Nami yelled and presumably bonked their heads. She sighed. "Now what do you think? Is he gay or not?" Luffy's eyes widened. "What?" he thought. "They're talking about that." "I don't think you should be talking about this," Zoro answered her. "For one thing, it's none of your business, which—" "Oh shut up, Zoro." The orange-haired navigator shushed him. Luffy smirked. "It's so nice to hear Zoro defending my privacy like that," he thought. "Yeah, don't talk to Nami Swan like that," Sanji yelled. Sanji-kun?" Nami asked. Luffy heard something that sounded like a mini tornado move across the room. "Yes, Nami-san?" he asked after a moment. "What do you think about it?" she asked him. He was quiet for a moment. "The rubber bastard is probably gay." He spoke after a moment. "He never did appreciate the beauty of our lovely ladies." "Thanks, Sanji-kun," Nami told him. Luffy could hear someone snort. "Yeah right," Zoro replied. "You're only agreeing with her because you want to get into her pants. Why you shitty? Honestly, if your advances were any more obvious, you'd be asking for her panties." Zoro continued. A fight presumably broke out between them, while Luffy had to hold his mouth with both of his hands so as not to erupt in laughter. Then something crashed in the kitchen. Luffy assumed it was Sanji and Zoro getting pounded into the ground. "Anyway," Nami announced in a dangerous tone. "Usopp." "I'm not going to say anything," he answered. "Oh, come on Usopp," Nami pleaded. Usopp sighed. "No," he told her. "I don't care if he's gay or not. I'll lower your debt if you answer," she offered. "You haven't asked Robin yet," he told her. She sighed. "Robin?" Nami pleaded. "Fufu if you want to know, just ask him yourself," she replied. "After all, he's standing in front of the door." Luffy looked around and saw an eye on the nearby wall. He glared at it and pouted. After a while he opened the door and entered into the kitchen. He grinned upon seeing the stairs. "Shishishi, you guys are all so funny," he told them. They blinked a few times. "Is breakfast ready yet?" he asked after a moment. "Soon," Sanji replied. He nodded and grinned and then sat on one of the empty seats, which was between Robin and Zoro. Usopp was on the other side of the table, Sanji was standing, and Chopper wasn't there because he was on watch duty. Next to Zoro sat Nami, who shot him an annoyed look. "So?" she asked. Luffy turned to her with faked confusion. "Shishishi, so what, Nami?" he asked. She raised her clenched fist. Luffy flinched slightly. "Are you gay or not?" she nearly yelled. Robin, who sat next to him at the table, trying to read a book, shook her head with a small chuckle. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. "How should I put this?" he said in a quiet tone, but then he raised his finger. "Ah." He pointed with his right index finger at Nami's chest and with his left at Robin's. "I like those," he said and grinned. Everyone looked surprised by the blunt proclamation. Nami gained a tick above her eye. "That's way too blunt," she yelled and punched him. His neck stretched and his head fell into Robin's bosom. He quickly stretched it back and glared at Nami. "Nami," he whined. "Would you do that for? Now Robin's going to be mad at me." He turned around and looked at Robin, who indeed put her book down on the table. She turned to her right where the rest of them sat. She crossed her arms. "No, Robin, don't strangle me," Luffy yelled. But nothing happened. He blinked in confusion and turned to his right. He saw Nami getting pushed into Zoro's lap by a multitude of hands. The hands then soon disappeared. "Humph. Witches and their fun." Zoro grunted in annoyance. He did not appreciate being part of Robin's revenge. "Morimo," Sanji yelled angrily. "Stop pushing Nami-san's head into your lap." Luffy snorted. Others' sweat dropped. "Well done, Sanji," he thought. Way to completely misinterpret the situation. Sanji, Usopp told him and shook his head repeatedly. "Fufu. My, Nami-san seems to like swordsman-san," Robin commented. Nami, who just raised her head, glared at her. Luffy burst into laughter, as did Usopp. "Nami Swan," Sanji yelled as he swirled back to her from the stove, crying and I'm tears. "Tell me it's not true." "It's not," she yelled and barely refrained from smacking his head. After a few moments, breakfast was finally ready and the crew started eating. Luffy started practically devouring the food and the rest of the crew quickly followed. Luffy was no more merciful at the table than in his previous lifetime, and he was much faster too, so it sometimes took all their effort to keep anything on their plates. "Would you stop taking everything?" Sanji yelled at him and smacked him over the head from the other side of the table. "But Sanji," Luffy whined. "It's training. Speed training." "That's a shitty excuse," he yelled at him, losing another piece of meat from his plate. "Honestly, who raised you, Luffy?" Nami yelled as barely prevented Luffy from taking everything from her plate. Luffy snatched a piece of meat from Usopp and devoured it. He stretched his left hand to Robin's plate, but it was slapped away by a disembodied arm. "Gramps. Also, mountain bandits," he muttered while munching on a steak he stole from Zoro. "Mountain bandits," Nami repeated, but then she glared at him when she lost half of the fries from her plate. "Yeah," Luffy confirmed, ignoring her glare. "When with mountain bandits, I had to be really aggressive at the table if I wanted to eat." He devoured her fries and he smirked at her. She clenched her fist in anger. His right hand traveled to Zoro, who quickly stabbed his piece of meat with a fork. "But thankfully, I was the best, so I had little trouble," he bragged and puffed out his chest. "Yeah, I bet," Usopp said dryly. "Well, Sabo and Ace usually gave me trouble, and they sometimes managed to get something from my plate, but no one else could compete with me," Luffy continued. Most of the Straw Hats looked at him in surprise. "Ace stole from your plate?" Nami asked. But he has such good manners." Luffy grinned. "Oh, don't let that fool you," he told them. "He only got his manners like a year before they left, and only because Sabo told him that he's bad with people." He paused for a while. "Which was true, by the way," he continued. "He didn't bother with me though." "You were that hopeless?" Usopp asked. The Straw Hat snickered. Luffy grinned. "Nah, he always said that most people naturally seem to like me even if I'm rude, so there's no point," he explained to them. Usopp gained a thoughtful expression while he was munching on his food. "It is kinda true," he admitted. "Everywhere we've been, people mostly liked you. Well, they were usually scared of Zoro." "Oh, Zoro yelled and violently stabbed his fork into a bunch of fries. "See?" Usopp muttered. Everyone laughed. "Yeah, Zoro's face is pretty scary," Nami added. He glared at her. She laughed. "You know, you're not going to disprove that by looking at me like that," she told him. He grumbled something and turned to his food, which was now gone. Usopp stood from the table after a while, having eaten his meal. "I'm going to replace Chopper so he can come and eat," he told them. Luffy grinned. "Okay. Keep an eye for any islands," he replied. Usopp nodded and left. Soon afterward, Chopper entered the kitchen with a drooling mouth and sat down. Robin smiled upon seeing him. He was the first member that she formed a serious bond with. After all, they were the most alike. Also, he was cute and floofy. Chopper started munching down on his food that was handed to him on a platter. Luffy left his plate more or less alone, knowing that he was up for most of the night. "Chopper, before you go to sleep I need to talk to you about something," he told him. Chopper looked at him and nodded, food still in his mouth. He continued to eat. After a while Nami left the kitchen. "Ahem, Luffy?" Zoro asked. Luffy looked at him. What's up, Zoro?" he asked. "I've been thinking," Zoro started. Sanji snorted. "That's new," he smirked. "Oh, shut up," Zoro muttered but didn't add the usual insult. "Anyway, I think the gap between us in fighting power is way too big." Luffy raised an eyebrow. "I think we should increase our training," he said. Luffy gulped down the food he was munching on. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "Sparring," Zoro answered with a smirk. "And not like that time before Arabasta. I don't want you to hold back." Luffy narrowed his eyes. "You know, I don't want to cripple you," he replied. Zoro sighed. "You don't have to go all out either," he told him. "Just make an effort. Use that sorry thing that you use for speed." Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. "Okay," he replied after a while. "But I won't use my sword." Zoro grinned. "Hey, I'm in too," Sanji said after a moment. Zoro snorted. "Like you could survive the training," he replied mockingly. "Why you stupid Marimo?" Sanji seethed. After a while longer and a fight which Luffy thoroughly enjoyed watching, Zoro left the kitchen to lift some weights. Chopper left to the men's quarters and Luffy followed him. After they arrived, Chopper turned around. "So what did you want to talk about, Luffy?" Chopper asked. Luffy sighed. "Do you have anything that would help me sleep?" he asked. Chopper blinked. "Well, I could make you something for that, but I'll need some things from the next island we dock at," he replied. Luffy sighed. "You don't have the stuff you need?" he asked. Chopper shook his head. "We're running low," he replied. "Before Sky Island, we were kinda poor and Nami said that we can only buy what we absolutely need." "Okay," Luffy said and smiled. "I should be able to wait until then. It shouldn't be that until the next island." Chopper looked at him for a few seconds. It seemed he had something to say but was afraid of saying it. "What?" Luffy asked. Chopper looked up at him. "Luffy, who are Brook and Jinbei?" he asked. Luffy froze. "They know," he thought. "Aye, they were my friends," Luffy answered after a while. He looked on the ground. But they died a long time ago." Chopper nodded solemnly. "Zoro said not to ask you," he told him. Luffy flinched. "But we all want to know what happened to you." Luffy nodded. "I'll tell you, but not yet," he answered. "I'm not ready. It's hard to talk about it." Chopper looked on the ground and nodded again in understanding. Luffy was thankful that Chopper didn't push the issue. "Oh, I need to ask you about something else," he suddenly shouted. Chopper was startled and quickly looked up. "You're our super doctor," Luffy started. "Shut up, praising me doesn't make me happy at all, asshole," Chopper shouted as he danced his little happy dance. Luffy smiled. "Chopper, what do you know about?" After a short conversation, Chopper went to sleep and Luffy left the men's quarters by climbing the mast. On the deck, Zoro was lifting his weights while the two girls were relaxing in their chairs. Sanji swirled around them like a tornado, offering refreshments even though they exited the kitchen not very long ago. Usopp was on the crow's nest. He was the one he was most worried about. Should he tell them now? No, Chopper went to sleep and he'd prefer if he could tell everyone at once. He sighed in displeasure. The girls noticed his annoyed expression. "What's wrong, Luffy?" Nami asked. He shook his head. "Nothing." He lied. He could see Robin eyeing him suspiciously, but he ignored it. "If we should have to fight the CP9, which we probably will, regardless of what Robin does, we'll need to be as strong as possible," he thought to himself. He headed towards the figurehead. "There's also the problem with Ace," he thought. "I can't really help him much right now. From what I know he'll get captured in the next 2 weeks or something like that, but I can't just leave everything and go after him." He sighed again. "Not to mention that I have no real idea where he even is. I only know the direction. If only I'd have killed that fat bastard in Jaya." He mentally scolded himself. Screw Whitebeard's request. I should have just ignored it and said he attacked me. He really didn't want to go through either Impel Down or Marineford again, but unless something changed, he was headed in that direction. He'd have to storm the Great Prison again. That, at the very least, was nearly certain. This time it should be easier. He thought to himself, but it didn't help any. Marineford and to a slightly lesser extent, Impel Down, was his own personal hell. Flashback. "I'm so close," he thought. Ace is in view. In front of him, Kizera materialized. "Ooh, it's Straw Hat," he announced. "The celestial dragons will be on my case if I let you go again." He raised his leg high and kicked. A beam of light shot from the end of his foot. Death wink. The greatest swordsman in the world slashed wildly, sending powerful flying blade attacks across the battlefield, using only a fraction of his strength. "Now, what are you going to do?" the swordsman asked. "You're being pushed further and further away from your brother. Back where you started." Kizaru mocked and kicked him across the battlefield, not even bothering to use much haki. Smoker sped towards him using his Moku Moku no Mi and struck him across the head with his sea stone-tipped jut. "Straw Hat," he snarled. "You won't leave this place." The encircling walls surrounded them. Whitebeard's attacks did not work against them. Magma rained from the sky. "I must save Ace," he thought. He jumped across the many terrified pirates who nearly lost all hope. He ran ahead, unknowingly making hundreds of them follow his lead. He was hit by several cannonballs. He was bleeding everywhere. "Erara, you've finally made it here," Aokiji announced. "Quite an entrance, son of dragon," Akainu continued. "This youngster sure is scary," Kizaru commented. Luffy looked above them at Ace. "But, you're not ready for this stage yet," Aokiji told him solemnly. "There is no way you can beat us, you know," Kizaru said. He tried to get past them. He activated his gear second. He followed after the pieces of frozen wood that he had thrown at the admirals and went through Kizaru's Loja body. "Too slow," Kizaru told him as he appeared in front of him and kicked him into a building. Blades approached his brother's head. "A CE," he yelled. Sand blades cut the executioners. An ice blade hit him in the shoulder. "I owe your grandfather," Aokiji announced. "But I have no choice. You've chosen your own death. I, Vice Admiral Momonga, stake my pride as a member of the Navy on stopping you here, Straw Hat." "He has no more energy," Momonga mused. Dalmatian smirked. "I'm not surprised," he said. "He's just a rookie, after all." Kizaru shot a laser beam through his body, intentionally aiming not to kill. Luffy fell on the ground. He could no longer move. He looked up at the admiral. "Without enough strength, you can't save anyone," Kizaru told him. "No matter how hard you try." He smirked. "Now will you please go away already?" He kicked him across the battlefield. "I can't believe the great Whitebeard himself would let reckless trash like you lead his army." "Iva-chan, I want to make this my final request," Luffy said desperately. "If I let you die here today, I won't be able to look Dragon in the eyes again," Iva told him. "If I can't save Ace, I'll want to die." He stabbed him with his nails. But it wasn't enough. Everything he had and it wasn't enough. At the end, his brother collapsed on the ground, dead. "Luffy!" Zoro yelled. The Straw Hat captain finally snapped out of his nightmarish memories. He felt pain in his right hand. He looked at it. It was blackened by haki and clenched. Drops of blood fell on the figurehead. He had broken through his own armament with his nails. "Luffy?" Zoro asked again. He unclenched his fist and took a deep breath. He stood up and turned around. "What, Zoro?" he asked. "You're bleeding," the unofficial first mate told him. Luffy wiped his hand in his shorts. "It doesn't matter," he replied. Zoro looked at him in concern, but then sighed. "Do you want to go sparring?" he asked. Luffy blinked. "Okay," he replied. "Oh, and the crab cook wants to go as well," Zoro continued. "Do you mind a 2 versus 1? Luffy shook his head. "No, not really," he replied honestly. Zoro and Sanji were both already quite strong, but with his speed and haki, it didn't really matter. However, they didn't have much room to fight as the crates and smaller boxes were everywhere. Except the deck above the storage room, the front of the ship. Luffy went to the right of the figurehead while the other two stood on the left. "If you focus, you should be able to keep up," he told them. He waited a few moments for them to prepare. Sanji tapped his shoes on the ground and Zoro took out all 3 of his swords. Then Luffy activated his Soru. He dashed ahead with a punch aimed for Zoro. The swordsman barely dodged it. In fact, the fist brushed his right shoulder. Sanji raised his right leg and attempted a sideways kick, but Luffy ducked underneath it and then jumped backwards, landing on top of his leg. Zoro ran towards them and slashed at Luffy. Sanji lowered his leg and Luffy would have fallen, but he kicked the air to stay in place. He blocked Zoro's swords by covering his head with his crossed arms while infusing them with armament haki. He kicked with his right leg and hit Zoro in the stomach, sending him into the railing. At the same time, Sanji attempted a high kick aimed for his ribs, but Luffy dropped from the air, causing the kick to miss. Sanji slammed his foot down on Luffy, but he blocked it with one of his hands and pushed his leg away. Zoro came from the other side and dashed ahead in an attempt to do a Santoryu Onigiri, but Luffy used his Soru and kicked the ground underneath him and punched ahead, stopping all 3 swords when they were in the same position with his fist. Much like Mihawk did when they fought. Sanji came from behind and kicked Luffy's legs, making him fall, but Luffy used one of his hands to touch the ground and then kicked in the direction of Sanji with both of his legs. The cook jumped back to dodge the kick, but his chest was still brushed by Luffy's feet, causing him some pain. The captain jumped back into a standing position. The green-haired swordsman attempted to slash Luffy, but he jumped in the air with Zoro and slammed a foot down on Zoro, which connected and slammed him into the deck. Sanji jumped into the air with a kick aimed for Luffy's stomach, but the captain easily dodged it by moving his body and used his own kick to send Sanji into deck as well. Zoro picked himself up and sent a flying blade attack at Luffy, but he unsheathed his sword and deflected it so that it flew somewhere in the sea. He sheathed back his sword and used his sword to dash towards Zoro with a punch ready. The swordsman somehow blocked the punch with two of his crossed swords, but he was unable to stand up to the overwhelming force of the punch and so was sent into the railing again. The sparring continued for a while longer until Sanji and Zoro were tired. Luffy was happy to find that while they were unable to really match him in any way, they were fully capable of reacting at the speed of his average Zoro. He didn't really go all out with his Zoro, but he didn't really restrain himself too much either. Their strikes were usually much too slow, but it was start and they managed to get a few hits in. In the strength department, Luffy also did not go all out and only used his observation haki for avoiding some of the attacks and armament for blocking Zoro's swords. They agreed to continue this training every day. Luffy was also pleased to find that their observation haki developed to some extent. They were able to dodge a few moves that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. A few hours later. A while after the reindeer doctor woke up, Luffy strode from the figurehead towards the rest of the pirates. "I need to talk to you guys about something," he announced. Everyone stopped in their activities. He sighed and turned to Robin. "Could you go and replace Usopp?" he asked her. "We'll be in the kitchen. You can listen in with your powers." She nodded and started climbing the mast. Luffy sighed and motioned for everyone to follow him. He opened the door and entered the kitchen, where Sanji was. "Hey, shitty captain," he protested. "I don't have any snacks for you." Luffy shook his head. "I have something to tell everyone," he replied. Sanji blinked a few times, but then nodded. Luffy waited for everyone to sit down. "Luffy, what?" Nami started. Luffy raised his hand. "Wait for Usopp," he told her. After a while, Usopp entered through the door. An ear appeared on the wall. Luffy sighed. "Okay, everyone's here," he began. He looked at every member of his crew. "What I'm about to tell you isn't good news," he continued. They looked at him in surprise. He sighed again. "At night, when Usopp and I saw a ghost, I didn't just see the ghost, I spoke to him," he said. Everyone gasped. "So why you did speak to him?" Usopp stuttered. Luffy nodded. "So, what did that ghost say that got you so serious?" Zoro asked. The others nodded. "First things first," Luffy answered. "You need to know what that ghost is." He paused for a moment. Everyone looked at him. "So, what is it?" Nami asked impatiently. "It's Mary," Luffy replied. Everyone looked at him in confusion. What do you mean, Mary?" Chopper asked. Luffy sighed. "Like I said, it's Mary," he repeated. Sanji's eyes widened in realization. "You don't mean the ship, do you?" he asked. Luffy looked at him for a moment and then nodded. Hey, don't be ridiculous," Nami stuttered. "You couldn't have spoken with the going Mary." Zoro gained a thoughtful expression. "But how come you're the only one who heard it?" he asked. Luffy shrugged. "No idea," he admitted. "But Usopp saw the ghost as well." Usopp nodded. "Yeah, but I couldn't hear anything," he said. Luffy kept saying that he heard someone calling him though. Luffy nodded. "But, it doesn't matter if you believe me or not," Luffy continued. "Either way, what Mary told me is true." Everyone looked at him. He sighed and took a deep breath. "The thing is," he started. "Our ship is dying." Everyone's eyes widened. "And Mary said that?" Usopp asked quietly. Luffy nodded. "Is it true?" Chopper asked. Tears started gathering in his eyes. "I'm no shipwright, but the keel is damaged," Luffy said after he nodded. "That means the ship can't be repaired anymore." He sighed. Everyone was quiet for a few moments. "So we'll have to replace the ship?" Zoro asked solemnly. Luffy nodded. Usopp stood up. Everyone looked at him. "No," he said. Luffy looked at him. "Usopp," he began. "No." Usopp interrupted him. "Mary is our ship. And not just that, she's more than that, she's our nakama." He glared at them. "We can't just replace her," he yelled. After that he stormed off. Luffy sighed and followed after him. The rest of the Straw Hats remained seated. "Usopp, wait," Luffy yelled after him. Usopp turned around. "Why?" he asked. "So you can tell me that we'll replace the ship again?" Luffy grabbed both of his shoulders with his hands and looked him dead in the eyes. "Usopp, we're in the Grand Line," he told him. "We're pirates." "But," Usopp started. "If our ship breaks down in the middle of the ocean, who will come to help us?" he asked him in a low tone. Usopp looked struck. "Even if we send a call for help, who will come for us?" Luffy asked. "We're pirates. People want us to die." Usopp looked on the ground. "I know you love the Going Merry and I'm sorry, but it won't even make it to the New World," he answered. Usopp looked up at him. He had tears in his eyes. "But Luffy, Mary's our ship," he said. "And Kaya gave it to us." Luffy sighed. "Look, the keel is cracked," Luffy said. "And the fact that the ship even has a ghost means it's already too late." Usopp looked down again. "Usopp, let's not fight about this," Luffy continued. "This is unavoidable. I'm not happy about it either." Usopp nodded. "I'm sorry, Luffy," he whispered. Luffy smiled. "It's okay, Usopp." They approached the next island. Luffy recognized it immediately. From the distance, everyone could see the extremely long trees, along with the very long grass. The island itself was also very long. The Long Island, Luffy thought. He grinned. "What's this place?" Luffy asked cheerfully. "It's cool. There's grass everywhere." "Humph. I don't know why you're so excited, Luffy," Sanji said. "This place looks plain to me." Nami nodded in agreement. "I wonder if it's inhabited?" Robin asked. Luffy grinned. "One way to find out," he yelled and jumped off the ship. "Yahoo!" "Hey!" Nami yelled with razor-sharp teeth. Topper convinced Usopp, who was still thinking about Mary, to come along, and they both jumped off the ship as well. Luffy ran ahead and noticed a weird-looking animal. It looked like a bear, except it was extremely tall. "What's that?" Chopper asked. "A person." Luffy laughed. "There's no person this tall," he told him and threw himself at the animal. "It's a bear." "There's no bear this tall either," Usopp yelled but followed his example along with Chopper. "He's floofy," Luffy yelled as he nuzzled against the animal's fur. But the long bear had enough of it and shook them off. "Meanie," Luffy yelled and stuck his tongue out. "Hey Luffy, look." Chopper yelled and pointed at something. Luffy followed where his finger had pointed and saw some sort of fruit. He stretched and grabbed it. He took a bite. "Ooh, it's an apple," he called cheerfully. He grabbed two of them and threw them at Usopp and Chopper, who caught them. "Try it." "Oh, this is good," Chopper yelled. Luffy laughed. He noticed a few more long animals going past them. A long fox with a long tail, a long deer, a long stork and a long dog. "Seriously?" Luffy yelled. "What the hell?" He ran up to the dog and petted him. "Shake," he called. The dog gave him his paw. He saw Usopp attempting to impress Chopper by trying to do the limbo underneath the long dog. Luffy snickered. "Sit," he ordered. The dog crushed the sharpshooter underneath him. Luffy laughed while Usopp struggled to get free. Finally, he told the dog to beg, so he stopped crushing the poor Usopp. He noticed two long bamboo sticks that extended into the sky. "There's something with that, but I can't remember it," he thought. Then one of them crashed into him. "Why you?" he shouted and kicked it, breaking it. He heard shouting from above. "Uh-oh," he thought. Then an old man crashed on top of him. After both picked themselves up, the man introduced himself as Tanja to the three crew members. He thanked them for getting him off the stilts and told them his dramatic tale of being trapped and eating apples on the top of the sticks for 10 years. "By the way, old man," Luffy asked. "Why is everything on this island so long?" Tanja turned around and faced him. "I'd imagine an outsider like you would ask that," he replied. "There is a reason." He pointed in the distance. "As you can see, this island has a vast expanse of grassland. All the animals live such relaxed lifestyles that they've grown longer," he explained. Luffy's sweat dropped. "Seriously?" But then, a gunshot was heard from behind them. Luffy turned around and saw someone he did not want to see. It was Foxy and his two henchmen. Luffy sighed. "Just by looking at me," he thought. "He's already pissing me off. That horse now belongs to me," the split-haired pirate announced. He turned around and noticed that the white long horse, or horse, was trapped in a net. "Yes, yes." The annoying woman with black things on her eyes that resembled glasses but had no glass, said. "This horse belongs to Oyabun now." Luffy strongly resisted the urge to face palm. What kind of stupid-ass pirate randomly steals a horse? He thought to himself. He shook his head. "Who the hell are you, anyway?" Luffy asked. Foxy fell on the ground in depression. "He doesn't know," he muttered. Luffy groaned. "Oh, you're Foxy," Luffy exclaimed after a while. Foxy's head raised hopefully. "The guy known for cheating in all of his Davy back fights." The captain of the Foxy pirates and both of his henchmen fell on the ground in depression. Luffy chuckled. He freed the horse from his net. He made his way back to their ship along his two nakama. He found the four underneath the Going Merry, apparently arguing with the inhabitants of the much larger ship that towered over their own. "Hey guys," he yelled. "Who are those guys?" Luffy, why you didn't accept the Davy back fight, did you?" Nami stuttered. Luffy grinned. "Nope," he said. She sighed in relief. The two men of the crew looked at him in disappointment and slight annoyance. "Why not?" Zoro grumbled. "They'll think we're afraid of them or something." Luffy shook his head. He pointed at the sexy Foxy, the ship of the Foxy pirates. "Those guys," he said, "are known as cheaters." Sanji looked at the pirate ship and then at Luffy. "Seriously?" he asked. Luffy nodded. "Hey, don't insult us," someone yelled from the ship. "If you're scared, just admit it." Luffy raised his head and glared at them. The man who spoke and several others flinched and backed away under his gaze. A man worth 160,000,000 berry was intimidating after all. "If you want to fight me," he murmured quietly, but everyone heard him nonetheless. "I'll take you all on." Several of the men sweated. "But I'm not playing a Davy back game against cheaters," he finished. He hoped that would shut them up. To be completely honest, everything about them just pissed him off. The captain himself was an ugly and arrogant bastard, not to mention annoying, their eyewear was ugly and pointless. Their ship was okay, but it was full of traps. He also wasn't too much of a fan of Davy back fights. After all, their very purpose was to take crew members away from someone. Luffy did not consider that to be good. His words seemed to have made the pirates stop demanding a match. They pulled away from their ship and landed somewhere else. A few of them jumped from the ship, presumably to locate their captain. Luffy sighed. "How come you know about that, Captain-san?" Robin asked him. He turned to her with a pout. Again with a he stared grumpily. "Luffy?" She corrected herself, interrupting his grumbling. "Ace warned me." Luffy lied. The truth was that Foxy, no matter how huge of a crew he might have acquired, was still a nobody. Saying he just heard about him might not have worked. The answer seemingly satisfied her, however. The Straw Hats headed to explore the island. When they returned to Tanjit's house, an interesting sight greeted them. An immensely tall individual stood in front of the house, snoring away. While asking if he should get them some refreshments, Tanjit bumped into him. Immediately upon seeing him, Robin tensed up. Luffy glanced up to her. Her eyes were wide. This was the first time that he witnessed her display outright fear, apart from maybe when Enel was about to electrocute her. The man removed his sleeping mask and looked at everyone present. His gaze stopped at Robin in particular. "It's him," she thought in panic. "It's him. Why is he here?" She started backing away. Luffy, who was walking next to her and Sanji, leaned towards her ear. "Keep calm," he whispered to her. She looked at him, fear still in her eyes. How does he intend to handle this situation? She asked herself. "No matter what happens, don't attack him," he told her quietly. Kuzan watched their interaction with interest. "So, who are you guys?" the Admiral asked despite already knowing all about them. "So, you must be a Mayan?" Chopper asked as he looked in awe at his height. The Admiral looked below and noticed him, making him flinch. "Uo, a tanuki, raccoon," he exclaimed. This got Chopper a bit mad. "I'm a reindeer," he yelled with razor-sharp teeth. "I've got antlers, see." "Uop, sorry." The man apologized and shook his hand in front of him. "Anyway, it's great to see you again, Nico Robin." Everyone looked at Robin. Everyone now saw how scared she was. Robin's really scared of him. Nami thought. Everyone else had similar ideas. "Uo." The man exclaimed and looked at Nami, or more specifically, her chest. "What?" Nami asked as she nearly jumped away, startled by the man. "I see a knockout babe with super boobs," he told her. "You free tonight?" Luffy and everyone else sweat dropped. "What are you doing, you lanky bastard?" Sanji yelled with shark teeth. "Humph. His idea of flirting is even worse than yours, Hero Cook," Zoro announced. Sanji turned to him with a face reddened from anger. "What did you say, shitty Marimo?" he yelled. "Like a Neanderthal, like you could know anything about that. But at least he's honest about it." Zoro finished with a smirk. A fight nearly broke out between them. Nami politely declined his request. After seeing how afraid Robin seemed, she didn't want to exactly yell at the guy, no matter how tempted she was. "Who is this guy?" Usopp asked loudly. This is Robin began with a shaking voice. "Marine Admiral, Kuzan." Luffy answered for her. "Also known as Aokiji." Everyone either gripped their weapons or tensed up. Zoro sweated. Against this guy, even Luffy has a good chance of losing. He thought as he nervously gripped his Wado Ichimonji. "Errara, don't be so aggressive." Aokiji replied and shook his hands in front of him defensively. I'm just on a stroll anyway, I'm not under any orders. He scratched his head. Anyway, you guys are he began, but then gained a thoughtful expression. Forgot what I was about to say. You're not making any sense. Sanji and Usopp yelled in irritation. The admiral sighed. How can this guy be an admiral? Usopp yelled at Luffy. Are you sure it's him? Yes. Both Luffy and Robin said in unison, though Robin's voice faltered. I uphold the model of lazy justice. The admiral told them. Everyone's sweat dropped. Well, it's better than thorough or unclear justice if you ask me. Luffy thought. Not sure if it beats blind justice though. We can see that. Zoro told him. The admiral laid down on the ground, using his hand to support his head as he still faced them. What are you doing? Nami asked him. He sighed. I'm tired from standing. He replied. Anyways, I'm not here to arrest you, so just chill out. He sighed again. Luffy briefly wondered if the admiral was annoyed just by having to speak. I'm only here to report my discovery of your group taking in Nico Robin. He continued. He yawned. So that the bounty can be what's the word. He stared at a random tree in the distance for like a minute. We calculated. That's it. He announced after a while. He yawned again. 160 million plus 60 million plus 79 million. He moved his fingers on his free hand. I don't know. He said after a while. Some big number. Too lazy to count, eh? Zoro asked with a sweat drop. Luffy ran up to him. Hey, Admiral guy. He greeted with a grin. I heard you have the ice loja. Aokiji blinked at the straw-hatted pirate. Could you show me? He pleaded. Make me an ice sword. No, a saber. No, a cannon. The admiral's sweat dropped. As did the other pirates. Show me some tricks. The pirate demanded. What am I to you, some circus freak? The admiral asked, but his voice was normal. It was as if he was too lazy to be irritated. Luffy grinned. Oh, come on. He yelled, practically in his face. Show me something. The man groaned. He stood up. Fine. He grunted in annoyance. He looked at Tanjit. You need to get to the next island, right? The small man nodded. He packed everything he needed and then everyone headed to the beach. So, how would you do that? Zoro asked the admiral. Said man shook his head. I'm too lazy to explain, so just watch. He replied. He approached the water and put his hand in it. He waited for a moment, calculating roughly how much power he'd have to release to do it. The Sea King appeared next to him from the water. A few of the Straw Hats shouted for him to watch out. He didn't listen. Ice Age. He finally announced. In an instant, as far as they could see, the ocean turned into ice. Along with the Sea King. Straw Hat jaws were on the ground, along with the old man's. Shishi, awesome. Luffy yelled. Everyone turned to him with their jaws still on the ground. This is the power of a marine admiral. Robin said slowly. Fear did not leave her expression after first seeing the man. Aokiji pulled his hand out of the ice. He walked up to the old man and the pirates. He looked at the old man. Just walk in that direction. He said and pointed somewhere in the distance. The ice should last about a week, so take your time. He walked past him. Dress warm. He continued. It'll be a bit cold where you're going. Is this a dream? The old man asked. But then he quickly turned around. Thank you, Admiral-san. He yelled happily. The marine just waved his hand. The Straw Hats helped the old man down on the ice along with his small wagon, or whatever it was. Thank you, Marine-san. The old man yelled and waved as he left. Thank you, guys. The Straw Hats waved back. Take care. Luffy yelled. After a while, they disappeared into the distance. The Straw Hats returned to the island, shaking because of the cold. Aokiji sat on the grass. He stretched his head. Luffy inwardly groaned. So here it comes. He thought. The Marine Admiral scratched his head and looked at him as he approached. What? Luffy asked. He shook his head. You are very much like your grandfather. He said after a while. Childish and reckless. Loud. Luffy huffed. I'm the captain. He announced and puffed his chest. I can be as childish and loud as I want to be. A few people's sweat dropped. But hard to fully understand. The Admiral continued, ignoring the interruption. He sighed. Your grandpa helped me a long time ago. He said after a while. Luffy narrowed his eyes. Kuzin mentioned that bit quite a lot. Grandpa told me about you. Luffy told him, interrupting whatever he wanted to say next. The Admiral looked up in surprise. Urara, what did he say? He asked. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Flashback. Grandpa, tell me about the admirals. Luffy suddenly asked while his grandpa and him were eating meat somewhere in the forest. The old man raised an eyebrow as he munched on his food. Why are you asking that? He asked. He gulped his meat. Then he got a victorious grin on his face. "Ah, you're finally considering becoming a Marine," he announced with a booming voice and a smirk. Luffy grimaced. "No way," he muttered. "Pirates are cooler." Garp lost his smirk. "What?" he yelled. "I'm a Marine. Is Grandpa not cool enough?" Luffy smirked. "Shanks is way cooler," he chirped out and laughed. The old Marine gritted his teeth. "Why you damn brat," he muttered and bonked his grandson on the head. He huffed and turned around. "If you're not becoming a Marine, I'm not telling you anything about the admirals," he said. Luffy pouted. But then he smirked devilishly. "If you tell me, maybe I'll think they're cool," he replied cheerfully. The Marine turned back to him, eyeing him suspiciously. "Clever brat," he thought. He sighed and shook his head. "Fine," he muttered. He gained a thoughtful expression. "Well, they are all a bunch of amateurs compared to me," he declared and puffed out his chest proudly. "But they're really tough. One of them could crush the three of you easy as pie," he continued, referring to the three brothers. "Wow, they're strong then," Luffy chirped out. Garp grinned. "Of course," he shouted, scaring away every bird in the forest. "Marines are strong." Luffy narrowed his eyes. "Pirates are strong too," he announced. His grandpa bonked him on the head again. "Shut up when I'm talking," he yelled. He took a bite out of his meat. "Anyway," he continued. "There's Sakazuki, Kuzan and Borsalino, but they're also known under their codenames, which I don't really get." He shook his hand and then took another bite. "Anyway, Sakazuki is a good Marine, but he always has that stupid expression on his face, like someone just threw a bunch of dog crap into his face." Garp told him. Luffy laughed. "And he's always on about absolute justice this, absolute justice that. He's really annoying with that." Luffy felt that Garp had more to tell him, but wouldn't say because he might fear that it'd turn him off from admiring the Marine. Nevertheless, he figured out that Grandpa did not really like the Magma Admiral. And he was happy to hear that. "Then there's Borsalino," he continued. "I don't really mind him, but he's kind of a weirdo. I never know what's going on in his head." He took another bite. "Kuzan is kinda cool," he continued. "I like him. Except being horribly lazy, he's a terrific Marine. Still just an amateur though." He turned to Luffy. "So, what do you think, Luffy?" he asked. Luffy grinned. "Grandpa is cooler," he announced. Garp got a slight blush. "I think. But Shanks is still the coolest." "Shush. Luffy interrupted and ran away laughing. "Why you damn brat." Luffy smiled at the memory. He looked at the Admiral. "He said you were an amateur," he told him. The man rolled his eyes, but his lip twitched from a barely suppressed smirk. "But that you're kinda cool anyway." The Straw Hats, except Zoro, looked at Luffy in shock. "Your grandpa thinks of a Marine Admiral as an amateur," Nami screeched out. Luffy smirked. "Grandpa is stronger than that guy," he said and pointed at the man. Aokiji shrugged. "I'm not ashamed to admit that," he replied. "Garp-san is after all, a legendary Marine. Even though I have a Loja devil fruit, I'd still be reluctant to fight him." Garp-san, Nami thought. Then, suddenly, a realization struck her. "Garp the fist," she yelled out. Luffy grinned. Shush. That's my grandpa, Monkey D. Garp," he said cheerfully. Everyone stared in shock. His grandfather is Garp the Fist. Robin thought in shock. His brothers are Fire Fist Ace and Blue Gentleman Sabo. He personally knows red-haired Shanks. When will it end? "Hey, Marimo, why aren't you shocked?" Sanji suddenly asked. Zoro smirked. "Oh, I knew from the beginning," he announced. "What?" everyone yelled. Luffy laughed. "I'm afraid to ask who your father is, Luffy," Usopp said. Luffy's laugh became louder. "His dad too," everyone thought. "Anyway, kiddies." Aokiji interrupted. Everyone looked at him. "I was kinda thinking here." He sighed. Then he looked at them. "Maybe you guys should all just die." Aokiji observed the reactions of the Straw Hat pirate crew. The pirate hunter gripped his swords nervously. Nico Robin took a step back. She did not try to activate her power, but he had no doubt that she was prepared to. The long-nosed sniper readied his slingshot. He did not aim it at him, but he gripped it. The orange-haired woman tensed up and looked at his every action. The blonde pirate, who reportedly fought with his legs, tapped the ground with his shoe. The little talking animal suddenly grew larger in size and clenched his fists. And the captain. Straw Hat Luffy did not move, but rather narrowed his eyes suspiciously. That was not a reaction he would expect. It was almost as if he knew something which the Admiral didn't. "The government doesn't consider you a real threat," he continued after a moment of tense silence. "Not really. Not yet." He sighed. His gaze rested on them, the captain in particular. "But I know better," he continued after a while. "Based on your previous encounters however, we know that you are a formidable crew. You are few in number, but from what we have seen from you so far, numbers don't seem to matter all that much. He paused for a moment. You are a daring group of determined individuals. The Admiral continued. You've had quite a number of daring exploits in your short life of piracy, and you are rapidly gaining strength as well as reputation. He sighed again. Based on that alone, your little group scares the crap out of me. Aokiji concluded. Hey, wait a moment. Usopp yelled and waved with his hands in front of his face. Why are you saying all that? Didn't you just come for a visit? Luffy snorted. Everyone turned to him. You didn't seriously think we'd just randomly meet a Marine Admiral for no reason, did you? He asked in a low tone. Everyone's eyes widened. The Admiral shook his head. However, Aokiji continued, ignoring the interruption. That's not everything. Everyone turned to him again. Based on reports from Navy soldiers and civilian observers. The man continued. You, Monkey D. Luffy, have won each of your fights with relative ease. Luffy's eyes widened. Now, it is true that you have only so far been in East Blue and the first half of the Grand Line, but the fact that you've managed to get so far so successfully is quite, shall we say, unnerving. Aokiji said. He sighed again. Your exploits are considered to be quite daring even when compared with those of the other rookies, such as for example Basil Hawkins or Eustace Kidd. He looked the straw-hatted captain in the eyes. There's also the fact that you seem to possess armament hockey. He continued and pointed at him. Luffy froze. He knows about it, he thought. The Admiral narrowed his eyes at him. Captain Smoker reported that you managed to defeat him twice. He continued. While the others may call Smoker incompetent or inexperienced, I personally cannot doubt his word. Luffy started sweating. You may have fooled everyone else in the world with that interview, but not me. The man concluded. Crocodile may be weak to water, but Smoker has no such weakness. And yet you defeated him twice. There's no way he was that careless. He sighed again. Then he looked at Robin. Then there's Yonkou Robin. He continued. She sweated. The size of your bounty does not just represent your strength, but also your threat level to the world government. Which is why a bounty of 79.000.000 berry was placed on your head at the age of 8. Luffy scowled. Damn marine bastards. He thought. If Grandpa wasn't so high up in the Marines, me and Ace would also get such ridiculous bounties for just existing. You betrayed, sidestepped, escaped, then found a new partner for you to use. Aokiji continued, startling Luffy from his thoughts. Time and time again you've rebounded and this time, you've chosen this crew as your next haven. He glanced up to Robin, who seemed quite startled and hurt by the accusation. How could the man who saved her when she was little, the man who knew the real reason why she couldn't find a permanent place in the world, say something like that? It also seemed to enrage Sanji. Hey, bastard, what are you trying to say? He yelled. What do you have against Robin Chuan? Usopp had to hold him back. I don't have anything against her. The Admiral said. The only reason I know her is because she escaped from me once. But that was a long time ago. He stood up slowly. If you doubt me, know that every organization Yonkou Robin has joined until now has been brought to ruin. He continued. She was always the only one to escape. He smirked. Why is that? He asked. Yonkou Robin. The past has nothing to do with us. Luffy yelled. So just stop it. That's right. Usopp agreed. If we cared about the past, we wouldn't have an ex-pirate hunter or ex-thief on the crew. Oh Nami yelled and bonked him on the head. Robin seemed to appreciate the trust they had for her. The past doesn't matter. Sanji yelled. Chopper nodded. That's right. Robin's our Nakama, don't badmouth her. He told him. The Admiral shook his head. He looked back at Robin. I see. He said. Poor fools don't suspect a thing. This of course enraged her. She crossed her arms. What do you want? She demanded. If you want to arrest me, then just do it. Arms appeared all over Aokiji, restraining him. Robin, don't do it. Usopp yelled out in panic. Robin. Luffy yelled. She looked at him. Flashback. Keep calm no matter what happens, don't attack him. After a moment, arms disappeared from the Admiral. Urara, I really did think you were going to do it. He commented. He scratched his head. Regardless, you really should watch yourself around this. The Admiral jumped back to avoid damage as Luffy slashed ahead with his sword. Afterward, Luffy immediately resheathed it. A drop of blood fell on the ground. The Admiral's eyes widened. He brushed his right cheek with his right palm and looked at it. The rookie had broken through his Loja defense and made a small cut on his cheek. Of course, the way he slashed he made it seem like he was trying to cut his head off. But what if he had expected him to move? His face darkened. He dropped his hand and glared at Luffy. You really shouldn't have done that. He said. Several of the Straw Hats gulped. Luffy smirked, but then he narrowed his eyes at him. You weren't stopping. He said coldly. I already said the past doesn't matter. Beside, whether or not you're an admiral or you think you know Robin," he continued. "I don't really give a crap about all that." The admiral smirked. "I see," he said. "You aren't about to let me tell you what to do, are you now, Captain?" Luffy grinned. "You seem to get the point," he replied. "Besides, I was the one who asked her to join and she hasn't done anything to deserve getting kicked out." A murmur of agreement could be heard from the crew. The admiral's eyes widened in slight shock. He invited her? He thought. She didn't weasel her way into the crew. "That's right," Sanji announced. "Our beautiful Robin Chuan stays with us." Robin smiled softly. Zoro snorted. "You'd still let her stay even if she did do something bad, hero cook," he yelled. "That's not true, Marimo." Sanji yelled back at him with razor-sharp teeth. Luffy laughed. He turned around and headed towards the ship. "Let's just go," he commanded. He received several uncertain looks, but after a moment, everyone shrugged and followed his example. Only, it wouldn't be that easy. "Who said you could leave?" Aokiji asked. Out of the corner of his eye, Luffy could see that the right half of his face had turned into ice. He sighed and shook his head in irritation. "Go on ahead," he said. "I'll have a little talk with the admiral here." He stopped and turned back to the marine. He waited for his crew to get far enough. "You know," Luffy began after a while. "Attacking over a cut on the cheek sounds like something Sakazuki would do." Aokiji scowled. Luffy chuckled. "Don't like the guy, he asked, once again narrowing his eyes. He chuckled. There was silence for a few moments. "And?" he began again. "Destroying 7 ships sounds pretty ridiculous for an 8-year-old girl with a non-destructive devil fruit." The admiral's eyes widened for a moment. Luffy laughed. "Shh. The real reason for her bounty couldn't possibly have anything to do with her ability to read poneglyphs?" he asked mockingly. The man looked struck. He knows about the real reason. He thought. "Ararara, I didn't expect you to know that," the admiral commented in a cold tone. "Just how did you learn this information?" Luffy shrugged. "I guessed it," he lied. "Being able to read those words sounds like something pretty rare." He briefly considered telling Aokiji that he knew about the ancient weapons as well, but that would pretty much seal that they'd have to fight. "You aren't ready for this stage yet, you know, Straw Hat," the admiral said after a while. "Even with armament, you can't possibly think you could defeat an admiral, do you?" Luffy shook his head. The admiral blinked in confusion. "I only want to keep my crew safe," he said simply. The admiral sighed. The ice disappeared from his body. Luffy blinked. "Damn you, Straw Hat," Aokiji thought. "Attacking you after this would just make me feel bad." The admiral shook his head a few times, but then looked back at the pirate and smiled. "I guess I owe you one for Arabasta," he said. "So I'll let you go this once." He turned around and headed for his bike. Luffy watched him leave with a big grin. After a few steps, the admiral stopped and turned around. "You know," he said. "I really don't know why you want your armament hockey to be a secret. I mean, it's unusual for a rookie, but not really shocking. Some people just have a natural affinity for a type of hockey, like the Kujas." Luffy blinked in confusion. "Kujas?" he repeated. The man scratched his head. "Ah, you don't know anything about them?" he asked. Luffy shook his head. "Well, they're the all-female pirate crew," Aokiji told him. "Ah, Hancock and the others," he thought. He smiled. "Arara, it seems you like the idea," the admiral replied and chuckled. "I can't blame you. Many of them are super babes." He scowled and looked on the ground. "Not very friendly though," he muttered. He looked back at the pirate. He scratched his head for a few seconds. "I guess I can keep that secret for you," he said after a while. Luffy looked at him in total shock. "I mean, you could have killed poor old Smoker twice, and you didn't, so. Thanks." Shushi. Luffy chirped out and grinned. The man shook his head. "Don't thank me, Mugiwara," he scolded. "This just makes us even. Besides, I never said I'd keep your secret forever." Luffy grinned. The man climbed his bike and drove into the distance. The Straw Hat pirate fell back on the grass, relieved. "My plan is still okay." After a few minutes of laying in the grass, Luffy headed back to the ship. He felt relief washing through his body. Aokiji may not keep his secret forever, but that was no necessary. All that was needed was a few weeks. He jumped up on the ship. Everyone was on the deck. "Luffy!" Chopper yelled and ran towards him. Luffy smiled as the reindeer clung on his leg. "Hey guys." Luffy greeted. Everyone smiled as well. "So, what happened?" Sanji asked. Luffy looked at him and grinned. "Aokiji said he owes us for Arabasta and said we could go," he told them. Everyone gasped. "He just let you go?" Nami stuttered. Luffy nodded. "So you didn't fight at all?" Zoro asked. Luffy shook his head. Nah. He replied. If we did, you'd hear us. He glanced at Robin, who was looking at the ground. Hey Robin. He said. She lifted her head and looked at him. Don't worry about what he said. He told her. She nodded but didn't say anything. You're our Nakama, so you belong on this ship. She smiled gratefully. That's right, Robin Chuan. Sanji announced cheerfully. Zoro chose not to say anything against the cook and instead just nodded at her. Hey, Sanji. Luffy called. The cook turned from swooning over the archaeologist and turned to him. Make us something to eat. I'm hungry from all this tension. Hi. He replied and ran into the kitchen. Let's set sail, guys. Nami called. After a good meal, Luffy took the ship's den mushi and headed towards the deck. He settled on the front of the ship next to the railing. A few of the crew members were interested. Are you going to call someone? Chopper asked. Luffy nodded. There are some things we need to get but we can't exactly buy them just anywhere. He replied. Everyone looked in confusion. What do you mean? Usopp asked. Luffy looked at him. We need to get a new ship, right? He asked. Usopp looked on the ground but nodded half-heartedly. Well, we don't want something like this to happen again, do we? Usopp and Chopper both looked up to him. Zoro, who was leaning on the railing, opened an eye. So, what are you going to do? He asked. Luffy grinned. Treasure wood at him. He replied. Everyone blinked in confusion. His grin widened. The Pirate King's ship was made from this wood. Everyone gasped. I've heard about this. A melodic voice announced. Everyone looked in its direction. There was an island once where this tree stood. The island was ravaged by endless war. The never-ending conflict took many lives. Thousands of people died from the war, but a giant tree, Adam, stood through it all. Every time the war would end and the civilization lay in ruin, the people would rebuild their homes near the giant tree. Robin walked up the stairs, bringing her chair with her. She put the chair on the ground and sat on it. So, what's so special about this wood? She asked after a while. Everyone looked back at Luffy, who grinned. This wood can make a ship so strong that cannonballs will just bounce off it. He replied. He remembered the Thousand Sunny, a ship so strong that even when hit with more than 20 cannonballs, it still held strong. It was barely even damaged. He smiled as he saw the disbelieving faces. Seriously? Zoro asked. Luffy nodded. But it's expensive. He said after a while. Fortunately, we have more than enough money for it. How expensive? Another voice asked. It was Nami. Nobody had seen her come. She might have just teleported there when she detected the word expensive. Luffy's sweat dropped. Hey Nami. Usopp greeted. Didn't see you come here. How expensive? Nami asked again, her eyes focused on Luffy. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Well, for a ship twice the size of Mary, it'd be 200.000.000 berry. He announced after a while. That was how much the original Sunny had cost. Everyone blinked. Are you sure that's expensive, Luffy? Zoro asked. I mean, considering how much we have. Most people just don't have that much money when they're buying a ship. Nami said proudly. Everyone smiled. Plus, it's illegal. Luffy added. Everyone looked at him wide-eyed. And rare. So, how are we going to get it? Robin asked. Luffy grinned and pointed at the den mushi. We'll ask Shanks. Luffy chirped out. But first, we should decide how big it should be so we'll know how much money we need. Everyone started thinking. Well, we should make it big enough so that we can have anything we want on it. Chopper told them. Luffy immediately imagined the Thousand Sunny that was as big as the Moby Dick, with him standing on the now gigantic figurehead. Right. Luffy announced cheerfully. We need a giant pool and a giant indoor forest and a giant meat park and a huge bronze statue. Everyone's sweat dropped. And a giant. Before he could say his next suggestion, Robin used her devil fruit to cover his mouth with a hand. He glared at her. We also need to make sure that the ship is not too big so we'll still be able to properly defend it. She replied. Her hand disappeared. Luffy pouted. Well, I do want my statue at least. He replied. Everyone groaned. Hey, I'm serious. There was silence for a while. What do you say if we order enough atom wood for 400.000.000 berry? He asked. If it's too much, we can just resell it. He looked at Nami in particular. Well, I think it's fine. She told him. I mean, we have a lot of money, we might as well make sure our ship has everything we need or want. Usopp, Chopper and Zoro looked at her in shock. What? She asked, irritated. They just shook their heads. So, now I'll call Shanks. Luffy announced. He dialed the number on the den mushi. Moosh moosh. Luffy called. There was the sound of someone gulping down a piece of meat. Hey, Luffy. A voice replied. Luffy recognized it immediately. "Hey Lucky," he greeted. Lucky Roo ate another piece of meat. "How you doing, Luffy?" he asked while munching on his food. Well, it seems there are people as rude as Luffy in this world, Nami thought. She did not approve of people talking while eating. "We just met an admiral," Luffy chirped out. The man on the other side gasped. "Really?" he asked. "Which one?" "Shishishi, Aokiji," Luffy replied. "Did you have to fight him?" another voice asked. "Ah, Ben," Luffy greeted cheerfully. No, he let me go." "Really?" Ben Beckman asked in surprise. "That's a new one." Luffy laughed. "He said he owes me for beating up Crocodile," he said after a while. "I guess that makes sense," the man replied. "But none of the other two would have done that, you know." He sighed. "Could you have defeated him if you fought?" he asked after a while. Luffy grinned. "Yeah, I think I could," he replied. Every Straw Hat looked at Luffy, surprised by his confidence. "I see," Ben replied. "You want to speak to the captain, right?" The snail puffed out some air. It seems Ben was smoking. "Yep," Luffy replied cheerfully. "Need to ask him something." "Okay. I'll carry the snail to him." They could hear the sounds of walking. After a while, the sound stopped. It seemed the first mate had reached his destination. He knocked on a door and entered. "Hey Ben," someone said groggily. "What's up?" "Another hangover, Captain," Ben Beckman asked in amusement. Luffy laughed. "Shishi. Same as always, eh Shanks?" he yelled cheerfully. "Ow. My head." The captain of the yelled. The Straw Hats could just imagine him covering his ears with his hands. Anchor. "Stop calling me that," Luffy shouted. The first mate chuckled. "Ah." Shanks yelled. Luffy started laughing again. Several of the Straw Hats also snickered. "Ouch, give me something for the hangover Ben," Shanks whined. The eyes of a few of the Straw Hat pirates widened considerably. "Flashback. Now." Luffy yelled, completely ignoring a fuming crocodile. Red-haired Shanks' impression. Luffy pretended to fall on the ground. "Oh, man, I have such a hangover. Ouch. Ben, give me something for the hangover," he said in a pretend pained voice and he massaged his temple. Nami and Usopp burst out in laughter, while Robin's laugh was a bit more controlled. The rest of the Straw Hats blinked in confusion at the trio. "Hey." The Yonkou whined. "Why are you laughing at me?" He humphed. "What did I say?" he asked in an even more whining tone. Luffy blinked at the Den Mushi a few times, also confused. "I'm pretty lost too," Luffy admitted. True, the Yonkou's complaining might be funny, but it wasn't that funny. "Captain San's impression of you was spot on, red-haired," Robin announced. Luffy glared at her. "Who's this Captain San you keep talking about?" he asked her in an annoyed tone. She chuckled. "Yufu. Lu." "Wait, you did an impression of me," Shanks yelled angrily. Luffy laughed. Shishi. "Yeah, almost forgot about that," he replied. "It was when Crocodile captured us." "Luffy?" Shanks yelled before realizing something. "Wait, Crocodile captured you?" Luffy grinned. "Yep, back when we were in Arabasta," he replied. He kept laughing and gloating over how defeated we were. The crew could see the snail phone sweat drop. "I guess Crocodile is pretty dumb then," the Yonkou announced. Luffy laughed. "That sounds totally like something Luffy would say," Zoro thought. "Shishi. Yep," he replied. "Anyway, we need some stuff for our new ship, so I called you." The Den Mushi sweat dropped again. "You do know I'm not a shop, right?" the red-haired pirate asked. Luffy pouted. "I know that," he yelled, but then sighed. "I just don't have any idea where the black market is." There was silence for a few moments. "You're going to Water 7, right?" Shanks asked. Everyone looked at Nami in confusion since they did not know what the next island was called. "Yes," Luffy announced, surprising everyone. Well, the black market is in St. Poplar, which is near where you're going," Shanks replied. "I don't usually do this, but I could pull some strings and have them deliver the stuff to you in Water 7. He paused for a while. "But you'll have to tell me what you need," he said after a while. Luffy grinned. "Thanks Shanks," he said cheerfully. "Well, we'll need enough atom wood for 400.000.000 berry." "Wait, your ship is your keel cracked?" The first mate, who was apparently still there, interrupted. Luffy's grin turned into a sad frown. "Afraid so," he replied and sighed. Usopp looked on the ground sadly. "Okay, what else?" the Yonkou asked. Luffy regained his grin. "Well, we should probably get a sea stone coating for the ship," Luffy replied. "Can we do that?" "I think they should have that," Shanks replied. "And it's a great idea, Luffy." "Wait, why sea stone?" Nami interrupted. "Well," Luffy began. "If you have sea stone underneath your ship, Sea Kings will ignore it," the Yonkou interrupted. So you can pass comm belt safely. Everyone's eyes widened in surprise. Sea stone has the same energy as the sea after all. Ben butted in. We'll be able to pass the comm belt? Usopp asked. Luffy nodded. Wait, why didn't I ever hear of that? Nami yelled. It's a government secret. Ben told her. Also, Kairoseki is sold at really high prices. Shanks announced. You should be prepared to pay at least 100.000.000 berry for the coating. What? Nami yelled. Shanks chuckled. There's only a few people who can get sea stone on the market and they jack up the prices. He replied. In truth, sea stone is usually hardly even worth a tenth of the price offered. We have the money. Luffy told him. The Den Mushi nodded. Nami sighed. It'd better be worth it. She growled. Luffy snickered. She glared at him. Well, anything else? Shanks asked. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. Well, some sea stone weapons would be nice. He replied. A few swords, a lot of bullets. Stuff like that. Got it? The Yonkou told him. And if you hear of anything useful or something you think we'll need. Luffy added. The Den Mushi nodded. Oh, by the way, how was Sky Island? He asked. Luffy grinned. Well, there was this mean jerk with a lightning loja who went around killing people. Luffy replied. So I kicked his ass of course. Lightning loja? The Yonkou asked. Gahaha. Sounds pretty neat. Luffy laughed. Shishi. Yeah, unless your opponent is rubber. He replied. An explosion could be heard in the background. Boss. Someone yelled. The red-haired pirate sighed. Sorry, Luffy, but it seems some stupid rookie just decided to commit suicide. He announced. I'll order the stuff for you. We can talk more later if you want. See you soon, Shanks, Luffy replied. He hung up and gained a thoughtful expression. He tried to think if he forgot anything important. Hey, Luffy. Zoro called after a few moments. Luffy turned to him with a confused expression. There is a giant frog doing the front crawl. He pointed ahead of the ship where indeed a very special frog was swimming. Ooh, a frog is doing the front crawl. Luffy repeated like it was nothing special. What? Nami asked. She looked at where Zoro had pointed. Ah, a giant frog is doing the front crawl. Robin blinked a few times and looked in that direction. Indeed, there's a giant frog that's doing the front crawl. She repeated with slightly widened eyes. The frog is doing the front crawl. Chopper repeated. Usopp's eyes bulged out. Why is there a frog in the front doing the front crawl? Usopp asked. Hey guys. Sanji yelled from the crow's nest. Why is there a giant shitty frog doing the front crawl? Shishishi, I love the grand line. The Going Merry approached the train station that stood along the tracks that the only water train in existence used. Not that anyone except Luffy knew anything about that. The giant frog, Yokozuna, swam straight into the tracks. In the next moment, a slowly approaching noise could be heard. As the noise got nearer and nearer, the scarred frog positioned itself on the barely visible tracks. The train approached. Hey, frog. Usopp yelled. You'll be killed. Get away. But the frog wouldn't listen. It stayed in place and instead solidified its position on the tracks, choosing a position that looked kinda like Luffy's gear second stance, except given the frog's body, it made him seem more like a sumo wrestler. Yokozuna put his palm slightly in front of his body. Luffy looked at him nervously. He knew the frog wouldn't really be harmed, but it still unnerved him. The train crashed into the frog. For a second it seemed like Yokozuna had actually stopped the train or changed its course, but then the train continued, blowing the poor frog away. After a while, the frog continued swimming. Oh, the frog is doing the front crawl again. Luffy announced. Chopper nodded. You're right. He agreed. The frog is doing the front crawl again. Yes. Usopp commented. The frog is doing the front crawl again, like before. Robin looked at them with a puzzled expression. Yes, I think we've already established that the frog is doing the front crawl. She replied. Everyone nodded. Grandma, pirates. A childish-sounding voice announced. Everyone looked to the left, where the train station was. A small blonde girl with two upward-pointing pigtails on each side of her head was standing on the small platform outside the station. Alongside her was a bluish rabbit. The Straw Hat Pirates could hear grumbling. What? Really, Chimney? An older-sounding voice announced. Okay. Hikyosh. Where's the Den Mushi? An old woman who also had blonde hair walked out of the station and crashed on the ground, nearly falling in the water. She had a big bottle of wine in her left hand, so it was obvious why. Luffy and the others' sweat dropped. I'll get it. The little girl yelled and ran into the station. She came out with a Den Mushi. This is bad. Zoro shouted. They think we're going to attack. The old drunk lady picked up the receiver. Then she gained a puzzled expression. She scratched her ear. What was I going to say again? She asked herself. I forgot. She put the receiver back on the snail. The straw hat sweat dropped. You're drunk. Usopp yelled with razor-sharp teeth. Luffy laughed. Shishishishi. The old lady kinda reminds me of Shanks. He commented. Everyone looked at him. Well, I can see why you'd think that. Nami replied with a deadpan expression. Luffy, Nami and Usopp jumped down from the ship. Hey. Nami greeted. Sorry we scared you. Ah, pirates are invading. Chimney yelled with an over-the-top shocked expression. No, no, we're not here to harm you. Nami tried to explain while shaking her hands in front of her face. Here, have some pale. Luffy announced and offered them the bowl. Ah, pale. The old lady replied and took one. This ought to go well with my drink. Hicknagagagaga. The little girl took two and gave on to her pet rabbit. I'm Chimney. She told them while she munched. She pointed at a rabbit. And this is my pet cat, Gomb. Pat. Everyone thought in confusion. The animal was clearly a rabbit. And this is my grandma, Kokoro. She said and pointed at the drunk woman. You're not here to rob the sea train, I'd wager. Nagagagaga. The old woman said and took a sip from her bottle. And just like that, the ice is broken. Zoro said. He was watching from the ship alongside the cook and the archaeologist. The guy is really good at making friends. Sanji replied and smiled. Robin smiled as well. Indeed. She said. I'm Luffy. The captain said. I'm the man who's going to be the pirate king. Really? Chimney asked. Luffy nodded. Yeah. He replied. The old woman laughed. Nagagaga. You're a pretty interesting guy. She told him. Afterward, Nami asked about the sea train, not knowing what it was. Luffy didn't bother to butt in. He was sure the old woman and the girl were better at explaining stuff anyway. After telling them about the sea train itself, Kokoro explained about the destinations the train could take you and how much this has helped the city of Water 7, which was the Straw Hats' next destination. The woman also explained that the city was the home of the very best of the shipwrights in the world. Luffy smiled. The best? He thought to himself. Franky. You're the next one. Here. The woman exclaimed and put a small paper into Nami's hands. This is a simple map of the island and a message of introduction. Give it to a guy named Iceberg and ask him to repair your ship. Nami gladly accepted the paper. They parted like friends with Kokoro offering them a drink should they meet again. As they neared the town, Luffy couldn't help but feel uneasy. He didn't know what would happen this time, but the crew was very nearly dealt two heavy blows in the city the first time around. Luffy was reasonably certain that Usopp would not leave the crew again, since he's had plenty of time to come to terms with the reality. Robin was another matter. Luffy couldn't exactly follow her around everywhere, since that would make it seem like he didn't trust her. He decided that should the CP9 make the same move again and Robin would go along with their plan, he and the crew would destroy them right here in the city. Also, if he would at any point cease to sense her presence with observation hockey for more than a few moments, he decided he would immediately move towards Eni's lobby. As they tried to enter the city, a fisherman warned them not to enter the city via the main entrance and said they should enter from the other side. They, of course, complied, though they were surprised by the helpfulness aimed towards pirates such as themselves. Of course, had they thought about it, they'd realize that water depends on business with pirates here to have their ships fixed. They entered the city through a side corridor of water, passing many buildings and admiring the city while doing so. Hey, pirates. Someone yelled. Pirate ships aren't allowed here. Are you here to plunder and pillage? Usopp's sweat dropped. No, we need to get a new ship. Luffy answered. Usopp felt weirded out. Who asks if someone's there to pillage them? He asked quietly and shook his head. The man who asked now smiled. In that case try the cape straight ahead. The man yelled. You can anchor there. Luffy thanked the man. They passed more houses. Hey, isn't that Straw Hat Luffy? Someone yelled from the outside of a restaurant. A few people walked out of the building, forming a small crowd. Hey, Mugiwara. Someone yelled. Luffy turned to his right where the people were. Shishishi. Hey. He yelled and waved, grinning. Their eyes bulged out. That's the man who defeated Crocodile and then refused to join the Shichibukai. One of them stuttered. They were left amazed, both by the fact that he was really Mugiwara and that he was so friendly and cheerful. After a few moments, the crew anchored on the cape. Luffy stood up from the figurehead where he was sitting during the travel and addressed them. Hey guys. He called. Come here. Everyone came over to the front of the ship. I want everyone to go and change as much gold as you can into berry. He told them. Don't get separated while you're doing this, okay? What are you going to do, Luffy? Sanji asked. Luffy looked at him. For now I'll guard the ship. He told them. He sighed. Anyway, exchange as much gold as you can and immediately return here. Everyone nodded. "You'll be able to shop later, so don't linger in the city with the money," he warned. "And stick together." Usopp, Nami and Sanji gasped. "Luffy, you're being..." Usopp started. Luffy's blinked a few times in confusion. "Yes, Usopp?" he asked. "You're being..." Sanji repeated. Luffy leaned towards them. "Why you're being responsible?" Nami stuttered out. Luffy blinked about 20 times before he had an answer to that. So he began. "Where does the surprise part come in?" They stared at him for a few moments. "Fufu. Indeed." Robin chuckled. Nami looked at her in shock. "Anyway, let's go get our money before our captain is totally weirded out by the witch, the crap cook and the liar." Zoro replied with a smirk. Of course, he soon received punishment for that. Topper's eyes shined in anticipation. "We're going to be so rich." He squealed out in joy. Nami's eyes turned into berry. "Let's go." She nearly shouted in excitement. Everyone's sweat dropped at her change in behavior. Luffy grinned as they left, Chopper, Sanji and Zoro, each dragging a huge crate on a cart behind them, with the other three each carrying a smaller box of the precious metal. After a minute, he dropped on the ground against the railing. "This should prevent any trouble with our money being taken," Luffy thought. "I'm pretty sure they'll be able to beat up just about anyone who tries to take anything." He closed his eyes and let out a sigh. "Everything should be fine," he said to himself. He sat there for a few moments and then he suddenly felt several presences on the ship skulking around. They weren't the best at keeping quiet either as he could hear them moving towards him. "Who are they?" he asked himself. In the next moment, he could sense a blade moving towards him without a shred of doubt aimed to kill. Just before it reached his neck, he quickly raised his hand and put it in the way of the blade. He activated his armament. Upon hitting his hand, Luffy heard the sound of metal breaking. He chuckled. "What a weak sword," he murmured. He opened one of his eyes and noticed the men in front of him. Franky's goons. He thought as he looked at their horrified snot-nosed expressions. His eye glanced down on the outfit of the man who tried to kill him. He opened his other eye and blinked a few times. "I love Franky and all, but his guys have no fashion sense." He stood up slowly. "So, who might you guys be?" he asked them, already knowing the answer. The men blinked at him a few times and recompassed themselves. The man who tried to kill him laughed shakily. "Haha, I guess it won't be so easy to kill you, Mugiwara," he replied in a stuttering voice. Then he straightened himself up and pointed at himself. "We are known as the bounty hunters whose name scares crying children into silence, the Franky brothers," he proclaimed proudly. Luffy closed his right eye and looked at the guys skeptically. "And we'll be taking your 160.000.000 berry head, Straw Hat Luffy." Luffy tilted his head, looking at them like the idiots they were. "Right," he said after a moment of silence. He picked his nose with his pinky. They still didn't make any move, so he looked at them in confusion. "I'm still alive," he reminded them. He took a step forward. He could see them struggling in their resolve. He grinned. They gritted their teeth in panic. "Wow, that must have really scared them," he thought to himself. His right arm blackened. They looked at it in panic. He blinked and looked at it. "Ah, that?" he asked and pointed at it with his other hand. They flinched upon hearing him speak. His grin widened. "I'm going to hit you with it if you don't leave my ship right now." "Shushi," he told them cheerfully. Their eyes widened in horror. Not that he could see, considering that they were hidden behind their goggles. He took another step towards them. Needless to say, they weren't on the ship for very much longer. After a few hours, the crew returned to the ship. To Luffy's relief, everyone was present, including Robin and Usopp. Luffy grinned. "So, guys, how did it go?" he yelled and waved at them. Zoro scowled. "Weird idiots tried to steal from us a few hundred times," he replied. Luffy blinked. "Ah, the ship was also attacked," he told them. They stopped in their tracks. "Really?" Usopp asked. "By who?" Luffy scratched his head. "Some stupid guys trying to look like cannonballs," he replied. "With purple stars." Their eyes widened. "Those were the same guys that tried to steal from us and attacked us," Nami told him. Luffy's eyes darkened. "How should I deal with this?" he thought. "I don't exactly want to get on Franky's bad side, but I can't keep worrying about Usopp and Nami constantly while in this city. The others should be fine, but those two, there's also the problem with the ship." He sighed. "Bring the money on board," he said. They continued walking. Each one of them, except Zoro and Robin, carried 2 suitcases. Robin carried 2 more with 2 additional hands, and Zoro was dragging a small cart of suitcases covered with a large brown cloth. Luffy grinned. "It seems money won't be a problem anytime soon," he thought to himself. "And there's still much more gold to exchange. We haven't even cleared half of what is on the deck." He kept smiling as the crew members brought the suitcases on the ship. But things kept troubling him. He wondered how he should approach the CP9 and Franky family issue. Until he gets on Franky's good terms, he can't leave the ship unguarded at any moment. Or his weaker crew members for that matter. And until the CP9 is dealt with, he can't really relax with the situation regarding Robin. What to do? Allowance, allowance. Chopper and Usopp screamed at the top of their lungs as soon as the suitcases were safely put in the women's quarters, which was probably the most secure room in the ship. Not only was it the only room with an actual key, you also had to go through another room to actually reach it. Hi. Nami answered in an irritated tone and grabbed one of the many suitcases, each containing 100.000.000 berry. She made her way back to the deck where the rest of the crew was now gathered. She sat on the top of the stairs and opened the suitcase and started handing out money to the crew. Thank God that we found gold on Skypia. She thought as she looked on the berry notes. If we hadn't, we wouldn't be just piss poor, we'd be broke in the next week. She smiled as she handed some money to Robin. Urara, I didn't think I'd see you so happy when handing out money, Nami-san. The archaeologist commented with a small chuckle. Everyone looked at them in surprise. The navigator looked at them and grinned. It's just that we are so rich. She squealed out. Everyone smiled. What money I gave you seems like nothing compared to what we have. Luffy laughed. Shishy. Well, I promised 1 billion, but it seems I lied. Luffy told her. Well, at least the witch is finally happy now. Zoro replied in a fake irritated sounding voice, but even he couldn't fight a small smile that formed on his lips. Luffy laughed. Hey, don't call Nami-san a witch, shitty Marimo. Sanji growled out. The smile turned into a scowl. You wanna go, crap cook? The swordsman growled and glared at the cook. The blonde snorted. Like you could ever beat me, you national treasure. He replied and turned away. What was that? Zoro seethed. Sanji gained a tick above his visible eye. You heard me, you deaf mosshead. He yelled back. Humph. You don't even have a bounty, so how could you beat me? The swordsman replied with a smirk. The cook scowled. When I get a bounty, yours will be insignificant in comparison, you lost Marimo. He answered with a twitching forehead. Yeah, dream on. Zoro told him and grinned mockingly. Why you? Enough. Nami yelled. Yes, Nami Swan. Humph. Which? The two finally calmed down. Here's yours, Sanji-kun. The navigator said and gave the cook his share. Then she looked at Zoro and Luffy. What about you guys? Zoro looked at her. I'm not going. He told her. I'll take a nap on the ship. Her eye twitched. You mean guard the ship, right? She asked in a dangerously low tone. He snorted. The true warrior is always on guard. He replied with a smirk. She shook her head. Right. Okay, what about you, Luffy? She asked him. He grinned. I don't need any. He told her. She looked at him oddly. I robbed a few people at Mocktown, so I have plenty. Nami's and everyone else's eyes widened. Why you rob people? She asked him in surprise. He laughed and nodded. Well, I sort of was a mountain bandit, you know. He told her. She blinked a few times. Did you also mug and beat up people? Sanji asked as he lit his cigarette. Luffy shook his head. No, well, Dayton did say she was going to force us to do stuff like that, but she never did. He replied. Underneath, she was a big softie. He paused for a moment, but then he smirked. Sort of like Zoro. He said. Everyone laughed while the swordsman glared at Luffy. Could you give my share to Chopper? She blinked a few times. I need to get some stuff for Luffy. The tiny doctor told her. Nami sighed. Fine, okay. She said and handed him some more money. Are you going to the bookstore by any chance, Dr. San? Robin asked after a few moments. The little doctor nodded. I'm going to look for medical supplies, but I'll also look for any new medical books. He told her. The archaeologist smiled. Then, would you mind if I accompanied you? She asked him. He smiled. Sure, Robin. He told her. Luffy eyed her with one eye slightly closed. He wondered if the CP9 had already contacted her, but he presumed that they haven't yet, otherwise she'd be way less relaxed and Luffy, after the time spent with his nakama in the past or future or whatever it was, knew how to recognize a crewmate's mood based on subtle signs. His eyes traveled lower. She wore her short black leather dress, complete with black thigh-high heeled boots. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. It was definitely the Enies lobby outfit. It was a bad sign on its own, but on the other hand. Is something the matter, Luffy? The object of his observations asked suspiciously. Luffy's eyes widened slightly for a split second because he was spotted. He looked at her face. No. He told her. I just thought that dress makes you look hot. The effect was instantaneous. All chatter died out immediately. He looked around at his shocked nakama's faces. He blinked a few times in confusion. Thank you. The archaeologist stuttered out. She wasn't actually embarrassed in any way, just surprised by his bluntness and honesty upon being found out. He smiled at her, but then he looked at the rest of them, except Chopper, who was just as confused as he was, and Zoro, who didn't really look all that surprised, with narrowed eyes. "What the hell did I say that's so shocking?" he asked them. Sanji was the first to snap out of it. "You see, even the shitty captain can see our Robin-chan's beauty," he yelled and twirled around her. His compliment didn't have even close to the same amount of effect that Luffy's had, however. After all, saying it every 5 minutes does tend to diminish the effect pretty soon. So she just thanked him politely. He swirled around back to the navigator. "And Nami Swan looks beautiful too," he complimented her. She ignored him, however, focusing instead on the captain. "I can't believe I heard that from Luffy," she said quietly. "You've got that right," Usopp agreed. "What are you even talking about?" Chopper demanded angrily, though in his hybrid form his anger looked more cute than intimidating. "Tell me." "Ah, Chopper, it's a human thing," Zoro said with a smirk and patted him on the head. He looked at the cook moving around the girls in his noodle form. Hopeless start, bro," he muttered quietly, but the cook still heard him and came at him with a strong kick. Luffy shook his head looking at his nakama. "I still don't know what I said." After a few more moments, the crew separated as they usually did upon first reaching an island. Robin and Chopper went together since they had similar destinations in mind. Luffy briefly considered going with them but decided against it. If he sensed she was in trouble, he could dash out in her direction, but she was far less likely to need his help. The other two, Usopp and Nami, definitely could use the protection since the Franky family was out to get them and their money. There was also the fact that Luffy had to handle the situation himself since he wanted Franky to build his dream ship and not Iceberg, however good he might be himself. Zoro stayed on the ship and Sanji went to get food supplies. The 6 nakamas separated soon after entering the City of Water. Luffy rented the Yagara bull that seemed to like him and used him to travel on the waterway. Usopp and Nami rented another one together since neither of them wanted to stay alone in the dangerous city. Though Luffy seriously wondered why they were called bulls. They didn't look even remotely similar to any bull he had ever seen. They traveled together, although they were separated a few times when Luffy saw something interesting or tasty. After a while they reached Dock 1. Luffy attempted to go over the fence, but a long-nosed shipwright stopped him in his tracks. Whoa, wait a moment," the shipwright said as he poked Luffy's forehead. "You can't enter here. Let's talk outside." Luffy complied and the other man jumped over the fence. "A CP9 swordsman," Luffy thought as he looked at the man. "Kaku, I think." "Square Usopp?" Luffy asked aloud after a moment. Nami seemed to agree with him, but the sniper didn't take too kindly to the comparison and proceeded to slap Luffy lightly on the cheek. Luffy just laughed in response. "This area is for authorized personnel only," the shipwright told them cheerfully. "Do you need something from this dock?" Nami took a step forward. "Ah, yes," she exclaimed. "We wanted to see Iceberg-san." "Iceberg-san?" he asked. "Are you costumers?" She handed him the introduction letter from Kokoro. "Ah, I see," he announced. "So, you know this Iceberg person?" Nami asked. He laughed. "How could I not?" he replied. "He's the mayor of Water 7. He's also the boss of the Galley Law Company and the superintendent of the sea train." Usopp whistled. "He seems very important," he said in an impressed tone. "He is," Kaku replied. "There's nobody in this town who wouldn't know of him." "So, where could we find him?" Nami asked. Kaku proceeded to tell them that he didn't know and that Iceberg was pretty elusive, so it was hard to track him down. "So, I take it you guys are here to repair your ship?" Kaku asked after a while. Luffy shook his head. "No, the ship's keel is already damaged, so we'll need a new one," he answered. Usopp and Nami nodded as well. "Ah, I see," the shipwright replied. "I assume you have enough money?" Luffy nodded. "Money is not a problem," he told him. "Oh, new costumers," another voice announced from behind Kaku. The shipwright turned around. "Ah, Iceberg-san," Kaku greeted. The owner of the voice raised his right hand in greeting. The mayor walked up to them with his secretary. "So you guys need a new ship, do you?" the man asked. He then turned to his assistant. "Have you identified them, Khalifa?" he asked her. She nodded and looked at her notebook, which contained wanted posters. "Yes, Iceberg-san," she replied. Straw Hat Luffy, Pirate Hunter Zoro and Nico Robin. Iceberg's expression turned into shock for just a split second upon hearing the last name. "Those 3 among the crew are wanted. Total bounty of 299.000.000 berry." She turned a page. "They are originally from East Blue. They are a crew of 7 and are known as the Straw Hat Pirates." She finished. Usopp wore a shocked expression. "They know everything," he thought. "You're pretty well known yourself, Straw Hat," the long-nosed shipwright commented. Luffy laughed. "Shishishi. I guess so," he replied cheerfully. "I see you've come a long way," the mayor told them. "I'm the boss of the city, Iceberg." He had a tiny white mouse in his shirt pocket. He patted its head with his index finger. "And this is a mouse that I found earlier," he announced with the same serious voice. "I think I'm going to call him Tyrannosaurus." Luffy's eyes bulged out. "That's an awesome name for a mouse," he thought. "I still have to buy him food and a cage," the mayor continued, still focusing on the mouse. "Already taken care of," the blonde secretary replied. The mayor turned to her with a slightly shocked expression. "Well, as efficient as always, Khalifa," he complimented. "Thank you," she said politely. "More importantly, you have a lunch meeting at the Chiza Hotel with the management of the glass factory in 10 minutes. After that you're giving a lecture at the Liguria Plaza, followed by a meeting with Mayor." "Don't wanna," Iceberg interrupted childishly. "Okay," the secretary replied. "Everything's cancelled." Just like that, Usopp yelled with a comically shocked expression. "Well, I'm powerful enough to do whatever I want," the mayor replied. "That's pretty irresponsible for a mayor," Usopp replied with a deadpan expression. "In any case, Iceberg-san," Nami said politely and handed him the letter they were given. "Look at this. It's a letter of introduction." He looked over the paper. "Look at their ship for them," he read. "Kokoro." His face gained a disgusted expression as he saw the kiss mark in the right bottom corner. "Crazy old woman," he muttered and crushed the paper in his hand. He raised his head to look back at the pirates. "I see," he said. "She must have assumed you were going to repair it." He yawned. "Now I'm bored," he told them. "I'll take you on the tour of Dock 1 and later we'll talk about the ship." They opened the giant steel door with the number 1 for them. At the same time in a different part of Water 7, Robin followed behind Chopper who was running to the bookstore. As she walked, a large masked man passed her. "CP9. He murmured in her ear. A few minutes later. During the tour of Dock 1, Usopp was grabbed by a man in a round black outfit with a purple star on it. As the boss of Water 7 and the Galley Law ended their tour, he turned around and faced the Straw Hat Pirate. "So, shall we talk about your new ship then?" Iceberg asked. "Would you prefer if we went into the mansion or should we stay here?" Luffy shook his head. "Whatever is fine with me," he answered. "We can talk here." The mayor nodded. "By the way, is it true that you have a woman named Nico Robin in your crew?" he asked hesitantly after a moment. Luffy blinked. "Yes, we do actually," he replied. "She joined our crew in Arabasta." The mayor gained a thoughtful expression. "Why, is there something wrong?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "No," the mayor lied. "Nothing's wrong." Luffy narrowed his eyes for a moment but then shrugged. "Hey girl," someone yelled behind them. "Are you completely shameless?" Icebergs looked past him and Luffy turned around to see what was happening. A blonde shipwright was berating Nami. He was pointing accusingly at her. "What?" the navigator asked in honest confusion. His cheeks flushed. "You're exposing your legs," he yelled at her. Luffy blinked a few times but then face-palmed. "This is place where men work. How dare you come here dressed like this?" Now, Polly, the blonde-haired secretary who stood beside Iceberg called. He looked in her direction and she walked towards him. "Calm down." As she reached him, he noticed that she too was wearing a short skirt. "That goes for you too, Khalifa," he yelled at her. "How dare you show yourself in that contemptuous outfit?" Luffy chuckled. "Polly is really shy," Iceberg commented while picking his nose. Lucci pulled him away from the girls. Luffy's eyes focused on the man. "The pigeon bastard," he thought and clenched his fist, but then he shook his head. "No, I can't do anything unprovoked anyway." "I can see that," he said aloud. Iceberg didn't notice his momentary tension. He turned back to the mayor. He sighed. "Ice-Asen," Luffy started. The mayor flinched at the nickname but didn't comment on it. "I wanted a new ship but I wanted it made out of atom wood. Is that possible?" Iceberg's eyes widened. "Treasure wood atom," he repeated. Luffy nodded. "Well, as I'm sure you're aware, making ships out of that wood is considered illegal." The mayor started. "Oro Jackson, the Pirate King's ship was made from that wood and it was so strong that the world government forbade the use of atom wood for shipbuilding soon after his capture. After a few years they even outlawed the wood itself." He sighed. "I'm sorry to say that, but I don't think any of our shipwrights would be willing to go against the law in such a way." The man finished. Luffy gained a thoughtful expression. "But..." Luffy raised his head. "There is one man who always wanted to build a ship out of that wood again," he continued. "But he gave up shipbuilding long ago." Luffy sighed, but truthfully he was glad the matter turned out this way. Now he didn't have to make any excuse for not ordering the ship here. I see. Luffy replied. And who is that man? The mayor's eyes widened for a split second. He hesitated. It's Franky, the boss of the Franky family. He finally told him. But I doubt he'd be willing to make a ship for a pirate of all people. Luffy nodded, but then a sudden realization hit him. He looked around wildly. What is it? The mayor asked. Hey, where's Usopp? He shouted at Nami, who was looking at the different ships that were anchored there. She looked around and didn't notice him anywhere. Luffy didn't either. Crap. He thought. I got distracted. He turned back to Iceberg. Could you please make sure my navigator stays safe? He asked him. The man looked at him oddly. What for? He asked. Luffy sighed. Ever since we got in the city, the Franky family kept attacking us, trying to steal our money. He told him. I'm afraid they might have kidnapped Usopp. The man's eyes widened. Then you should go look for your friend. He told him. The Franky family often do things like that. We'll look after her for you. Luffy nodded. Iceberg expected him to start running towards the gate, so he was startled when Luffy suddenly jumped in the air. Nami walked towards the mayor. Hey, Iceberg-san, where did he go? She asked him. He looked at her. He thinks your friend might have been kidnapped. He told her, evoking a shocked reaction. Khalifa had seen the superhuman jump. This could be a problem. Luffy hated to leave Nami in the midst of the shipyard, surrounded by the CP9 agents, but he knew they wouldn't dare to make any sort of move in the broad daylight like this. Plus, they would actually protect her from any Franky family members should they try to make a move, since they had to keep their real identities secret. He also knew about Franky's connection to Iceberg, so he could be reasonably sure that she would not be kidnapped too well in his presence. He landed on a tall building and looked around. He focused his observation hockey. It was a lot harder to locate someone in a crowded city like this, and his specialty was armament, not observation. Nevertheless, he was pretty decent at it. He tried to spot Usopp's presence, but it was hard. So that's why he tried to sense if anyone was fighting, specifically, if a group of people was fighting or beating up a single person. He sensed 3 cases like this. One was on the very edge of his reach, and he knew they couldn't have gotten Usopp so far away so quickly. 2 were near. One was in the direction of the Going Merry. It seems the Franky family was also attempting to search the ship. The other was nearer. It was close by actually, in the backstreets of the great metropolis. He activated his Zoro and dashed ahead. On a backstreet of Water 7, behind a few shops, Usopp laid on the ground next to the wall. He looked very roughed up. Now, Nai-chan, you're going to get us some of that money of yours. The man nearest to him commanded with a large smirk on his face. There were many others behind him. No. The sharpshooter yelled. The man lost his smirk for a second. Still you talk back. The man said. But no one's going to help you now, so you'd better just give up and do as we say. He punched the sniper in the gut. He spat out some blood. I'm not going to do that. Usopp yelled, but he had trouble speaking at the moment. He tried to stand up but could barely even lift his body. You are not in any condition to talk back. The man in charge yelled and prepared for another punch. Someone poked him on the shoulder with his finger. What? He asked and relaxed his arm. He turned around. Behind him was a man in a straw hat. When did he get here? Someone stuttered out. Luffy clenched his right hand and slowly moved the arm across to his left shoulder. Then he swung it, hitting the man sideways in his ribs. The man flew 100 meters and embedded himself in the wall of a house. He fell out of the wall and on his knees. He spat out blood. The Franky family only now noticed what had happened. Usopp was a little quicker than them. Zambai. A few of them yelled as they turned to the right. The man tried to get up, but he couldn't. After a moment he collapsed on the ground. That was one of Luffy's normal punches. Luffy Usopp stuttered as he turned back to the man in question. Are you okay, Usopp? Luffy asked in an uncharacteristically low tone, with the straw hat still shadowing his eyes. I'll be fine. Usopp replied and sat against the wall. I should have gotten here sooner, Luffy murmured. Finally he lifted his head. Usopp was startled as he saw the look in his eyes. He had never seen his captain this angry before. His occasional anger outbursts due to bad mood paled significantly in comparison. Said captain turned around. The thugs seemed to agree with him as they started sweating and some even started backing away. Don't mess with my nakama. Luffy muttered darkly as he glared at them, but everyone heard him nonetheless. Many of them gulped. That's the guy from the ship. Someone yelled in panic. A few of the eyes widened. It seems some of them recognized him. Some however remained clueless of the deadly aura and the implications of facing the Straw Hat pirate who had just punched their leader aside like a bug. Fools like that do exist. One of them in the back, who was larger than the others, laughed obnoxiously. "Muahaha. So you're the captain of that useless weakling, are you?" he asked mockingly. He stepped towards the front. "No, don't provoke him," someone else yelled. A single Kariki destroyer ignored him, however, and stepped in front of Luffy. "And how weak are you if you had to gang up on him?" Luffy asked rhetorically. Even if Usopp was weak compared to the monster trio, Luffy knew he wouldn't lose against a single opponent. Usopp was resourceful and clever, he could hold his own. He proved all those things even back when Luffy first met him in Syrup Village. So, the only conclusion Luffy could reach was that a few of them ganged up on him. His words seemed to anger the larger man, and he swung his fist towards Luffy. The pirate dodged his punch, letting it go past his head. He pulled his right arm behind him, stretching it. "Gomu Gomu no pistol," he announced and punched ahead, hitting the large man in his armor, which to him looked more like some sort of an adult diaper. Upon contact, the armor cracked and shattered completely, falling off afterward, revealing an actual adult diaper. Luffy would have laughed normally, but his current mood was a bit too murderous for that. He pulled back his arm and looked around at the rest of them. "You guys are done," he told them in a low tone. After hearing this, they started running, every man for himself. But it wouldn't save them. Like in a nightmare, Luffy dealt with each man separately, punching them into the ground while others could do nothing. When only one remained, Luffy appeared before him using his Soru, and the man started stumbling away backwards. He looked around and realized he was the only one standing. He hit a wall behind him. Don't," he pleaded. Luffy stopped just in front of him. "Your friends will all be fine," he said after a while. "But if something like this happens again, I won't be so nice next time." But that he punched a man in the gut and walked away, making him fall on the ground after a moment. On the other side, next to another wall, Usopp was trying to get up. Luffy walked up to him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't push yourself, Usopp," he told him. He helped him get up and they walked together towards the location of the ship. Luffy noted that Zoro was done with the weaklings. "I'm sorry for not getting here sooner," Luffy apologized. The sniper sighed. "It's my fault," he said solemnly. "I was too weak." Luffy shook his head lightly. "You're not weak, Usopp," he told him. The sniper chuckled. "Don't lie," he said bitterly. "I was useless against them." He lowered his head. Luffy sighed. "Usopp, you're a sniper, not a martial artist," he replied. "So don't worry." His friend nodded, though Luffy could tell it was still bothering him. He hoped he'd be able to prove to Usopp that he's not useless soon. As they reached the ship, they could hear Sanji yelling something. They boarded the ship. Luffy Sanji begun, but he stopped when he saw how beaten up Usopp was. "Chopper!" the cook yelled. The tiny doctor came running almost immediately. Zoro too woke up and came down towards them. "What the hell happened?" he asked. Luffy put the sniper on the ground and let Chopper check him over. Both the swordsman and the cook looked at him expectantly. "Well?" Sanji asked. He sighed. "Usopp got kidnapped by those bounty hunters," he said simply. Their eyes darkened. Sanji bit his cigarette in half while Zoro clenched his fist. "Did you?" Zoro started. "Yes," Luffy interrupted. "I beat them all up." "What about Nami Swan?" Sanji asked. Luffy looked at him. "She's fine. I left her with Ice-Asen," he replied. "I told them to look after her." Sanji nodded. "But I'll go get her now," he continued. "By the way, where's Robin?" "Chopper said she just disappeared," Sanji told him. Luffy clenched his fist. "Damn," he thought. "They must have contacted her." "Well, first I'll get Nami here and then we'll talk about that," he replied. After a short while of jumping he reached Dock 1 again. He jumped across the fence, which nobody had prevented him from doing this time, and entered the area. He noticed that Nami was sitting somewhere on the side, right next to Khalifa and a blushing Polly. He grimaced. He didn't like seeing her next to a CP9 member, but for now it was fine, since they weren't enemies. At least not yet. "Luffy?" Nami called. "What happened?" Luffy walked towards them and sighed. "Usopp was kidnapped and beaten," he told her in a low tone. She put her hand in front of her mouth in shock. "Is he okay?" she stuttered. Luffy nodded. "I beat them up and took him to the ship," he told her. "We should get going as well." She nodded and stood up. He looked at the two who were sitting next to her. "Thanks for looking after her," he said. "No prob," Khalifa began. "Straw Hat," someone called behind them. Luffy turned in the direction. It was Iceberg. He walked towards them. "I take it you've solved the problem." Luffy nodded. "It's okay now," he replied. The man nodded. "Good, is there something else you want?" he asked. Luffy shook his hand, but then he remembered something. I heard about the Aqua Laguna," he begun. "Could we find a place for the ship while that happens?" What's a Qualaguna? Nami asked in confusion. It's Luffy began. It's a huge wave that hits the city every so often. Khalifa interrupted. We can find a place to put your ship, but it'll cost you. Polly added. Luffy nodded. Nami didn't object. I'll talk to you tomorrow about that. He told them. Let's go back. After that, they left. A few hours later. Early in the morning, Luffy checked the Water 7 newspaper. Contrary to what he had expected, nothing had happened. He was confused. After a quick breakfast, the crew had decided to look for Robin. Just as they were about to leave the ship, well, Sanji and Usopp stayed, they saw her walking towards it. They waited for her to board and when she did, they saw she had a troubled expression. She looked directly at Luffy. I need your help, Luffy. It was a somewhat gloomy morning. It wasn't even close to noon yet when Luffy followed Robin into the city after she asked him for help. She carried a specially made pirate lunchbox, which she was given by Sanji before departure. They passed many buildings and shops. Luffy was in a relatively good mood ever since Robin returned to them. He figured that the extra strength made all the difference from before, so the archaeologist wasn't so afraid of the CP9's threats. So, Robin, what do you need my help with? He asked her as they walked together. She lowered her head slightly. One could tell she was troubled. I was contacted by government agents. She told him. His eyes widened slightly for a moment. I need you to take care of them. He grinned. Okay. He said simply. He looked at her sadly. She looked troubled, but he could understand that. They walked into the back streets of the great city together. He walked a bit behind her and looked around. They've entered quite a shady neighborhood. So they're here? He thought. Are they waiting for her to report back or something? He didn't know much about their previous experience in Water 7. Back then, everything happened so suddenly. There was also the matter of with Usopp, which he had fortunately managed to avoid this time, but it distracted him too heavily back then to have any other, more useful memories that could help him. Not that he was a very observant person to begin with. He continued looking around, but suddenly she stopped and he bumped into her. Sorry, Ro, he started. Luffy. She interrupted and turned around. Thank you for doing this. She leaned closer to him. And then she did something he never ever would have expected from her. She kissed him. As she pulled back, Luffy couldn't help but just stare at her. His mind went blank for a moment. Robin, he began. Then he heard something click. Suddenly he felt his energy draining. He felt dread creeping through his body. He looked at her face with widened eyes. After many weeks of traveling with them, she had put her old mask of cold indifference back on her face. He looked at his hands. On his right wrist was a cuff, presumably made from sea stone. Robin, why? He tried to ask. As I'm sure you found out by now. She interrupted coldly. I've been using you. At that moment, Luffy felt two relatively powerful auras approach them. He recognized both of them. He heard clapping. Well done, Nico Robin, someone announced with an emotionless voice. Two people approached them from behind. Luffy looked in her eyes. She might have been the best at finding out or hiding things in the crew, but not even she could fool him like this. Her face might have shown indifference, but her eyes only showed regret, sadness. I don't believe you. He said calmly. It was a statement, not a question. Before she could respond, one of the two men started walking towards them. You'd better do, Mujiwara. A voice told him. Nico Robin was never your nakama. He turned around. Standing behind him was Rob Lucci. Luffy smirked slightly and narrowed his eyes at him. Who are you guys? Are you playing dress up? He asked. The man ignored his comment and stepped over to Robin. If you must know, we are government agents. The man continued calmly. She made a deal with us. In exchange for her help, we'll erase her bounty. The words were half right. The bounty would be erased, but only because Robin would be neutralized as a threat. She would be sent to the Marine HQ. When the world government would no longer have a use for her, she'd probably be disposed of. Either that, or sent into Impel Down, where she could atone. And why did you need her help? Luffy asked. It was a simple question, but it was very obvious that they didn't have a good answer for it. We have need of her special skills. Lucci replied. Luffy laughed. I would have thought government assassins would be able to complete their mission without the help of a pirate. He mocked. He looked at Robin. He put his hat on his head and looked her in the eyes. And don't try to lie to me. He told her. When someone gets a bounty this high, there's no turning back. It's a special deal, You're not famous enough to be a Shichibukai, and there are no other deals. He interrupted her. Which means there's something else you're after. She bit her lip, unknowingly shattering her cold facade. Why does he have to make this harder than it has to be? She thought as she tried to compose herself. So why, he continued. It doesn't concern you. She yelled, interrupting him. What I do is my own business. If I stayed with you, I could never make my wish come true. "And what is your wish?" he asked in a serious tone. "Enough." The third voice interrupted. It was the other CP9 member that Luffy had fought, Blueno. He grabbed Luffy from behind and forcefully put the cuffs on his other wrist as well. The pirate tried to resist, but he was too weakened from the sea stone. Luffy groaned. This sea stone really is something. He thought in irritation. Without Robin's little trick, there's no way the cow guy of all people would be able to cuff me like this. With that, Robin and Lucci turned around and started walking, while Blueno pushed him forward to do the same. "So, where are we going, guys?" Luffy asked cheerfully. A bit too cheerfully. Robin's eyes widened in shock upon hearing him speak. "What's this?" she thought. "Why is he acting like this? Doesn't he ever panic?" "You'll see soon enough." Blueno answered in his usual calm tone. Luffy sighed. "Ah, you guys are so mean." Luffy whined. "First you kidnapped my archaeologist and then you don't want to tell me where we're all going." "I wasn't kidnapped," Robin retorted. Luffy snorted. Robin, I don't think you're dumb enough to believe the CP9 will erase you bounty," he replied. Everyone stopped walking at that moment. "I never said we were CP9. Lucci told him. Robin glanced up to him and was startled by his expression. His eyes were wide. He was sweating. Shishi. Then I must have guessed." Luffy lied. Then they continued walking. "It's too bad that Robin did this," Luffy thought. "But then we'll just go after her and rescue her." Then he got struck by a sudden realization. "What if they lock me somewhere so I'm unable to go after her?" he thought in panic. He sweated a bit. "No." He signed in relief inwardly. "Aqualaguna is approaching. Since she wants to save us, she must somehow tell the crew where I am before that happens." Then he grinned. "Now for my next trick." Ahem. Everyone looked at him. They suddenly got a terrible feeling in their guts. The islands in the South or Warm. Robin turned around in shock. "He's singing. Ina puru, their heads get really hoot. Blueno, please shut him up." Lucci ordered. Blueno took out a cloth and pushed it in Luffy's mouth. The rubberman simply gulped it down. "And they are all idiots," Luffy continued louder, much to the assassin's annoyance. Ahem. Next verse. Then, before Luffy could continue singing, they've reached their destination. It was a shady-looking place. A small house that seemed to be falling apart. Luffy's eyes bulged out. "This looks like a house from a horror story," he commented. Robin silently agreed with him, but didn't voice it. "Are there zombies in there?" he asked childishly. "Don't be stupid," Blueno told him. He pouted. They entered the house. Blueno pushed him through the door roughly. He entered as well and closed it. There was a table in the middle of the room with 2 chairs around it. Lucci sat down on one of them. "Nico Robin," he began. "We went through all that trouble to get him, so I hope what you said is true." Robin proceeded to sit down on the other chair. She put the lunchbox on the table. "It is," she replied. "After all, why would I lie given what is on the line?" He studied her expression for a moment and then looked at the table. "Right," he answered. "In any case, we need to discuss our plan for this evening." "Well, it's unlikely that Straw Hat will be able to make much difference now, I still don't want him listening." She stood up. "Then I'll take care of it," she told him. He nodded. Luffy thought it was odd that he trusted her with that, but then he remembered that she probably couldn't afford to betray them. There were 2 other rooms in the small house. Robin opened one of them with her devil fruit and then she walked up behind him and pushed him forward, indicating that he had to move. He complied and started walking. When they entered the room and she closed the door, Luffy immediately turned around. "You know, Robin, there's really no need to pretend anymore," he told her. "I know everything." She stared at him. "About CP9 Iceberg, Franky," he continued. With every word uttered, her expression became more and more shocked. "I also know about O'Hara and the Buster Call." "How long?" she began. "Oh, I knew about the reason for your bounty even before you joined the crew," he interrupted her. She started sweating. "The demon of O'Hara. That's not. And I found it unfair for you to get such a high bounty for doing absolutely nothing that would deserve it," he finished. She couldn't help but just stare at him in shock. He sighed. "But I honestly thought that you were going to trust me enough to deal with those guys," he told her. "I wouldn't even need to use Gear Second for them." He looked at her shocked face and grinned. "But I can still do it if you unlock these cuffs," he continued. "How is this possible?" she yelled. "Why do you know everything?" "Maybe I'll tell you when you return to the crew," he said smugly. "Didn't I make it clear enough that I'm leaving?" she yelled at him. He narrowed his eyes at her. "And didn't I make it clear that I'm not letting you?" he countered back, leaving her back in shock. There was silence for a few moments. "Sabo tried to leave once, to protect us," he whispered. "If I hadn't followed him then he'd be dead." And he was dead. He thought to himself regretfully. He was dead in one lifetime. She began. They said they were going to do whatever it takes to accomplish their goal. She took a deep breath. They threatened to kill the weaker Straw Hats when you weren't around. She continued. And they said that if they had to, they'd use a buster call against us. An arm appeared on his shoulder. He glanced at it. Robin threw something at it. The other arm caught it. I'm sorry, but I have to do this. So this is goodbye. She said with a tone of finality. A sharp needle penetrated his skin. When you wake up, it'll all be over. You should all forget about me. She told him with sadness apparent in her voice. Goodbye. A lone tear slipped down her cheek as she left. A few hours later. Luffy? Someone yelled. And no, let me sleep, he murmured and turned his head around. Luffy, wake up. Someone else yelled. He groaned in annoyance. Then he felt sudden pain in his left cheek. Someone had slapped him. Wake up. A demonic voice yelled in his ear. This jolted him awake. Before him was his crew, minus Robin and Sanji. The demonic voice of course belonged to Nami, although right now her face looked more worried than demonic. He sat up. Are you okay, Luffy? Chopper asked worriedly. Luffy nodded. I'm fine, he muttered. Then he remembered what had happened. Robin. He yelled. We need to get Robin. Zoro walked up closer to him. Did she do this to you, Luffy? He asked. Luffy nodded. Luffy, Chopper cried out. Did Robin really betray us? Luffy looked at him in surprise. Did you see her? He asked. Tears started falling from the little doctor's eyes. Yes. Flashback. The crew secured the ship in one of Water 7's water garages, owned by the Galley Law Company. Then they went shopping for supplies, except for Usopp and Zoro, who stayed on the ship. When they returned, late in the afternoon, there was still no sign of either Luffy or Robin. So they went to search for them. In the middle of searching, Franky appeared, wanting to take revenge for Luffy beating up his minions. Since he couldn't spot Luffy, he settled for the next best thing, which was the only present crewmember with a bounty, Zoro. The battle lasted quite a while. Franky had the initial advantage, thanks to his metal body and his many weapons, but Zoro was faster and stronger. During the battle, they heard screaming. It came from Iceberg's mansion. Franky, getting a bad feeling, rushed there. Zoro followed Franky, yelling that the fight wasn't over, and the crew followed him. Upon entering the mansion, Franky immediately headed for Iceberg's room. When he entered, he was effortlessly defeated by the CP9. Robin was with them. She told them that they will never see each other again. The crew was shocked and demanded an explanation, which was not given. They tried to fight the CP9, but were defeated as well. The crew was left there with an unmoving Iceberg, while CP9 left, taking Franky. Chopper checked his pulse. He was still alive, barely. The mansion burst into flames. The Straw Hats escaped, carrying Iceberg and the shipwright foremen that were defeated in the building. Upon leaving the building, many shipwrights and townspeople confronted them. It seems CP9 spread rumors about how the Straw Hats were disgruntled and planned revenge because Iceberg refused to build them an Atom Wood ship. They also made sure Robin was seen. Upon seeing who they carried, they knew better. I see. Luffy replied. While they were explaining, Nami had taken his cuffs off using her mad lockpicking skills. By the way, where's Sanji? He asked. Zoro snorted. As soon as me and Franky started fighting, he rushed off, saying how he needs to save his Robin. He explained so, what happened here? Luffy sighed. As you can probably guess, Robin put those he pointed at his cuffs that were finally off. On me when she distracted me. Distract you? Nami asked him in surprise. How could she distract you? You have that observation thing. Luffy's face gained a very slight shade of red. Everyone looked at him confused. Well, he began, slightly embarrassed. She kissed me. Their faces became very similar to the surrounding white wall at that moment. What? Everyone yelled at him. He scratched his head. I know. He said. I was pretty surprised too, so I kinda dropped my guard. Zoro was the first to snap out of it. The crab cook is going to have a field day. He announced in apparent joy. Anyway, enough about that. Did she betray us or not? Nami demanded loudly. Luffy sighed again and gained a serious expression. No. He replied. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. But we need to rescue her. She is trying to sacrifice herself for us. Everyone looked at him in shock. She only obeyed their orders because they threatened to use a buster call on us. He continued. What's a buster call? Chopper asked curiously. Luffy shook his head. We don't have time for this. He said. Robin is being taken to Eni's lobby right about now. They all got determined looks on their faces. Zoro smirked. So, your orders, Captain? He asked. We rescue Robin and Eni's lobby burns tonight. That is the end, so, thanks for watching. Comment down below with recommendations on what fanfic I should do next. And remember to like and subscribe to my channel.